Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, certain names echo across the millennia with a particular dread. Among the champions of chaos, few inspire quite the same mixture of fear and fascination as Lucius the Eternal. His story is not one of simple corruption or straightforward damnation, but rather a twisted tale of pride, perfection, and a curse that transforms immortality itself into the cruelest of prisons. This is the story of a warrior who sought to become the greatest swordsman in the galaxy, and in achieving that dream, lost everything that made such achievement meaningful. The Forges of Chemos. Long before the galaxy knew him as the Eternal, before Slanesh claimed him as a champion, before the screaming faces adorned his armor, there was simply Lucius. Born on the world of Chemos, and he entered a society that had nearly destroyed itself through industrial excess and environmental collapse. The people of Chemos lived in a world of stark contrasts, where the wealthy elite dwelled in opulent spires, while the masses toiled in manufactorums that stretched across continents. It was a world that bred ambition, that rewarded excellence, and that had no patience for mediocrity. From his earliest years, Lucius displayed a talent that set him apart, not merely in one discipline, but in nearly everything he attempted. His mind absorbed techniques with frightening speed. His body moved with a grace that seemed almost supernatural, even before any genetic enhancement. He quickly gained the attention of sponsors among Chemos' elite, wealthy patrons who saw in this young prodigy an opportunity for reflected glory. They provided him with the finest tutors, access to the most advanced training facilities, and exposure to arts both martial and refined. But it was the blade that truly called to Lucius. Where others saw swordsmanship as merely one martial skill among many, he recognized it as the purest expression of combat artistry. The sword required balance, timing, precision, and an understanding of motion that went beyond simple strength or speed. It was a weapon that rewarded dedication and punished the slightest lapse in concentration. For someone like Lucius, who craved perfection with an intensity that bordered on obsession, the sword became everything. His instruction in the blade began early, and his progression was meteoric. Within months, he had surpassed students who had trained for years. Within a year, and his tutors found themselves struggling to match him. There was something in the way Lucius approached swordsmanship that went beyond mere technical proficiency. He seemed to understand the rhythm of combat on an instinctive level, reading the subtle shifts in his opponent's weight, the micro-expressions that telegraphed their next move, the patterns in their breathing that revealed their intentions. Yet even in these early years, there were troubling signs of what would become Lucius's defining characteristics. He was a poor teacher, his natural talent making it difficult for him to understand why others struggled with concepts that came so easily to him. During training sessions, accidents became disturbingly common. A student might lose an eye to what Lucius claimed was merely a teaching demonstration gone slightly awry. Another might find themselves scarred after Lucius emphasized a point with perhaps more force than was strictly necessary. These incidents were explained away as the unfortunate results of intensive training, but those close to the situation began to see a pattern. Lucius took a certain satisfaction in these moments, a pleasure in demonstrating his superiority that went beyond healthy competition. There were also the darker rumors, whispered accounts of individuals who had crossed Lucius or insulted him in some way, only to be found dead in the lower levels of the city. Lucius always had an explanation. They were beggars who had attacked him, brigands who had chosen the wrong target, thieves who had made the fatal mistake of threatening someone with Lucius's training. The authorities, influenced by his wealthy patrons, were always satisfied with these explanations. But the pattern remained, a trail of bodies that marked Lucius's passage through the martial community of Chemos. The annual swordsmanship tournament was the pinnacle of competitive blade work on Chemos, an event that drew the finest swordsmen from across the planet. It was more than mere sport. It was a demonstration of skill that could elevate a competitor's status, secure lucrative sponsorships, and guarantee a place among the warrior elite of Chemosan society. Lucius entered the tournament while still remarkably young, facing opponents with decades more experience. The bookmakers gave him little chance against established champions, warriors whose names were legendary in the dueling circles of Chemos. His first opponent was a veteran swordsman, a man twice Lucius's age who had won the tournament 3 times in his career. The duel began with the confidence of experience facing youthful ambition. The older man tested Lucius with probing attacks, seeking to understand his opponent's style and identify weaknesses to exploit. What he found instead was something unprecedented. Lucius didn't simply defend against these attacks. He absorbed them, learned from them, and adapted with a speed that seemed impossible. Every technique the veteran employed, Lucius had an answer for. Every pattern in his attacks, Lucius identified and countered. The turning point came when the veteran landed what should have been a decisive blow, a thrust to Lucius's midsection that would have forced any normal opponent to yield. The strike connected, drawing first blood, and the crowd gasped at what appeared to be the end of the young upstart's tournament run. But Lucius's reaction was not what anyone expected. Instead of yielding, instead of acknowledging the touch that tradition demanded, he smiled. It was not a smile of good sportsmanship or gracious acceptance of a superior opponent's skill. It was something else entirely, an expression of pure ecstasy that transformed his features into something almost inhuman. What followed was brutal. Lucius dismantled his opponent with methodical precision, each strike carefully calculated, not merely to score points, but to inflict pain, to humiliate, to demonstrate absolute superiority. He took the veteran apart, piece by piece, scoring touches on every major target area, each strike perfectly placed to maximize the psychological impact. By the time the duel ended, the veteran was not merely defeated, but broken, his confidence shattered as thoroughly as if Lucius had physically destroyed him. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some were horrified by the display, recognizing something fundamentally wrong in Lucius's approach to the duel. Others were enthralled, captivated by the raw skill on display, even as they were disturbed by the cruelty with which it was delivered. Among the spectators was a figure who had watched the entire tournament from the shadows, a hulking presence whose interest in Lucius went beyond mere appreciation of swordsmanship. This was a sergeant of the Emperor's Children, one of the legendary Space Marine legions that served the Emperor of mankind in his great crusade across the galaxy. As Lucius was about to receive his victory, a complication arose. The defeated champion's supporters and disciples, enraged by what they saw as dishonorable conduct, moved to attack the young victor. They swarmed toward him, a mob of angry swordsmen who cared nothing for tournament rules in their desire for revenge against this arrogant youth who had humiliated their master. Lucius readied himself to face them, his blade still in hand, that disturbing smile still playing across his features. He welcomed the challenge, saw it as an opportunity to further demonstrate his supremacy. Before the mob could reach him, the sergeant of the Emperor's Children stepped from the shadows. What happened next was so swift that many in the crowd barely processed it. The Space Marine moved through the attacking swordsmen like death incarnate, not killing them, but incapacitating them with precise strikes that left them groaning on the ground, thoroughly cowed without being permanently injured. It was a demonstration of martial prowess on a level that even Lucius had never witnessed. A reminder that for all his skill, there were beings in the galaxy who operated on an entirely different plane of capability. The sergeant turned to Lucius, studying him with eyes that had witnessed countless battlefields across the stars. He saw the talent, the raw potential that could be shaped into something extraordinary. But he also saw the flaws, the pride and cruelty that would need to be tempered or channeled. After a moment of consideration, he spoke words that would change Lucius's life forever. The Emperor's Children were recruiting, seeking the finest warriors that Chemos could provide to fill their ranks. Lucius had demonstrated the skill they sought. If he was willing, if he had the strength and dedication required, he could join the Legion and serve the Emperor himself in the conquest of the galaxy. For Lucius, the decision required no thought. Chemos had become too small, its challenges too limited. He had proven himself the finest swordsman on his homeworld, and now the galaxy itself beckoned. He accepted the sergeant's offer without hesitation, leaving behind his former life without a backward glance. The sponsors who had supported him, the tutors who had trained him, the rivals he had defeated, all became instantly irrelevant. Lucius's eyes were fixed on new horizons, new challenges, new opportunities to prove his superiority. The transformation from human to space marine was brutal, a process that reshaped body and mind through genetic engineering, hypnoconditioning, and surgical implantation of enhanced organs. Many aspirants did not survive the transformation. Those who did emerged as beings far beyond human capability, warriors who could fight in the harshest environments, who could shrug off wounds that would kill normal men, who possessed strength and speed that made them living weapons. For Lucius, the transformation only amplified what was already present. His natural talent became superhuman capability. His obsession with perfection intensified into an all-consuming drive. He rose through the ranks of the Emperor's children with the same meteoric speed that had characterized his rise on Chemos. The Legion prided itself on perfection in all things, but on the pursuit of excellence that went beyond mere functionality into the realm of art. This philosophy resonated with Lucius on a fundamental level. Here was an entire legion that shared his obsession, that understood the drive to be not merely adequate, but absolutely superior. He found himself among brothers who appreciated skill, who valued artistry in combat, who saw warfare as something to be perfected rather than simply endured. His skill with the blade quickly became legendary within the Third Legion. Other battle brothers would gather to watch him train, studying his techniques, marveling at the fluidity of his movements. He sparred against the Legion's finest swordsmen and defeated them all. Champions from other companies, warriors with centuries of experience, found themselves unable to match Lucius's combination of speed, precision, and tactical awareness. His reputation grew until even those who had never seen him fight knew his name, knew that he represented the pinnacle of martial excellence within a legion that prided itself on such achievement. By the time the Great Crusade was in full swing, Lucius had achieved the rank of captain, commanding the 13th Company of the Emperor's children. It was a position of tremendous responsibility and honor, recognition of both his combat prowess and his leadership capabilities. Under his command, the 13th Company became known for aggressive close-quarters tactics, for seeking out the enemy's champions and challenging them to personal combat, for turning battles into showcases of individual skill and courage. Yet even as Lucius achieved success after success, certain character traits continued to manifest themselves. His fellow officers considered him proud, foolhardy, and at times almost childish in his need for recognition and acclaim. He required constant validation, needed to be acknowledged as the best, the finest, the most skilled. Any perceived slight to his abilities would send him into barely contained fury. He kept detailed accounts of his victories, obsessively tracking every duel won, every enemy champion defeated, every battle where his prowess had proven decisive. Among his brothers in the Legion, one stood out as something approaching a friend. Captain Saul Tarvitz of the 10th Company was in many ways Lucius's opposite. Where Lucius craved glory and recognition, Tarvitz was content with his position and focused on serving the Legion and the Emperor to the best of his ability. But where Lucius was flamboyant and attention-seeking, Tarvitz was steady and reliable. Yet despite these differences, or perhaps because of them, the two officers developed a bond. Tarvitz represented something that Lucius simultaneously admired and resented, a warrior who had earned genuine respect through consistent excellence rather than flashy demonstrations of skill. Even Tarvitz, however, remained wary of Lucius. He recognized his brother captain's tremendous talent, but also saw the dangerous edge to his personality. There was something unstable about Lucius, a sense that beneath the veneer of civilized behavior lurked something more primitive and cruel. Tarvitz hoped that time and experience would temper these qualities, would help Lucius mature into a more balanced warrior. He could not have known that the opposite would prove true, that the very traits that concerned him would be the seeds from which Lucius's damnation would grow. The breaking point. During the expansion of the Great Crusade, the Emperor's children frequently found themselves fighting alongside other Space Marine legions, forging bonds of brotherhood with warriors from different gene lines and traditions. One such alliance brought them into contact with the Lunar Wolves, the legion commanded by the Emperor's most favored son, Horus Lupercal. The Lunar Wolves had their own martial traditions, their own ideas about what constituted excellence in combat, and their approach often differed significantly from the Emperor's children's pursuit of technical perfection. It was during one of these joint campaigns that Lucius encountered Captain Garviel Loken of the Lunar Wolves. Loken was a rising star in his own legion, a member of the prestigious Mournival that advised Horus himself. He was known for his tactical acumen, his unwavering loyalty, and his straightforward approach to warfare. Where the Emperor's children saw combat as an art form to be perfected, Loken saw it as a problem to be solved by whatever means proved most effective. The two captains met during a training exercise, and almost immediately the differences in their philosophies became apparent. A sparring circle was formed, attended by officers from both legions, and Lucius and Loken faced each other with blade in hand. For Lucius, it was an opportunity to demonstrate the superiority of the Emperor's children's martial arts to these barbarians from Chthoniya. For Loken, it was a chance to learn about his allies' capabilities and perhaps teach a lesson about the difference between dueling and actual combat. As the duel began, Lucius displayed the full range of his abilities. His blade work was exquisite, a demonstration of technique that had been honed through thousands of hours of practice and hundreds of actual combat encounters. He moved with fluid grace, each strike perfectly balanced, each defensive maneuver economical and precise. To the assembled Emperor's children, it was like watching art in motion. To Loken, it was informative but not particularly intimidating. He had faced enemies who were trying to kill him in earnest, and he understood that the controlled environment of a sparring circle bore little resemblance to actual warfare. Lucius pressed his attack, confident that he was demonstrating clear superiority. He employed advanced techniques, feints within feints, blade work that required split-second timing and absolute body control. Loken defended competently, but without particular flair, his style straightforward and pragmatic. To Lucius, it seemed only a matter of time before he broke through Loken's defenses and scored the decisive touch that would end the duel and confirm what everyone could surely already see, that he was simply the better swordsman. But Loken had been watching carefully, studying Lucius's patterns, identifying the assumptions that underlay his technique. The Lunar Wolf captain had warned Lucius before they began that this would not be a typical duel of blades, that he would demonstrate how a Lunar Wolf fights, how they win regardless of the circumstances. As Lucius had dismissed this as bravado, unable to imagine that anything but superior swordplay could determine the outcome of such an encounter. Then, in the middle of one of Lucius's most elaborate attack sequences, Loken did something completely unexpected. He dropped his sword. The blade clattered to the ground, and for the briefest instant, Lucius froze in confusion. This wasn't how duels worked. You didn't simply abandon your weapon in the middle of combat. Before he could process what was happening, before he could adjust his attack or question Loken's bizarre tactic, the Lunar Wolf's fist connected with his face. The punch was delivered with all the force of a Space Marine's enhanced musculature behind it. Lucius's nose shattered, blood exploding across his face, and he stumbled backward, his own blade falling from nerveless fingers as his hands instinctively moved to his ruined features. He had been beaten, not outsworded, not outmaneuvered in some brilliant display of superior technique, but simply punched in the face like a common brawler might handle a tavern dispute. The shock of it, The sheer indignity of the defeat was almost worse than the physical pain. The lunar wolves in the crowd laughed, appreciating Loken's practical demonstration of their legion's philosophy. A lunar wolf does whatever it takes to win. Rules, conventions, notions of fair play. These were luxuries that had no place when victory was the only acceptable outcome. The Emperor's children were less amused, seeing the incident as a breach of dueling etiquette, a cheap trick that had nothing to do with actual martial skill. For Lucius, the defeat was devastating on multiple levels. Physically, the damage to his nose refused to heal properly, despite the attention of the Legion's best apothecaries. Where before his features had been symmetrical and aesthetically pleasing, he now bore a permanent reminder of his humiliation, a crooked nose that marred what he had considered his perfect visage. Some of his fellow Emperor's children, perhaps trying to lighten his mood or genuinely unaware of how he would take the comment, referred to him as too pretty, even with the injury. The comment cut deeper than any blade. If even with this disfigurement he was still considered merely decorative rather than dangerous, then he had failed to project the image of lethal capability that he craved. But the psychological wound was far deeper than any physical injury. Lucius had built his entire identity around being the greatest swordsman in the Emperor's children, and by extension, the greatest warrior. This defeat suggested that his skill was somehow insufficient, that there were aspects of combat that he had failed to master. The fact that it had not been a defeat based on superior swordsmanship did nothing to ease his wounded pride. If anything, it made it worse. He had been beaten by someone who had simply refused to play by the rules that Lucius assumed governed such encounters. In the days and weeks that followed, Lucius became obsessed with his defeat. He replayed the duel in his mind endlessly, analyzing every moment, trying to understand where he had gone wrong, how he could have anticipated Loken's unorthodox tactic. The healthy response would have been to learn from the experience, to broaden his tactical thinking, to understand that combat was not constrained by the rules of the sparring circle. Instead, Lucius's pride twisted the lesson into something darker. He concluded that the problem was not his approach, but rather that he had not been ruthless enough, had not been willing to do whatever was necessary to secure victory. He began a campaign of self-modification, seeking to mark himself in ways that would serve as constant reminders of his purpose. The defeat at Loken's hands had left him with a crooked nose that the apothecaries could not or would not fully repair. Rather than seeing this as a permanent humiliation, he decided to embrace it as the beginning of something new. If his features were no longer perfect, then perfection would have to be found in other ways. He would mark himself, scar himself, or turn his body into a living record of his progression toward ultimate martial excellence. It was around this time that Lucius encountered Serena de Angelis, a remembrancer attached to the 28th Expedition Fleet. The remembrancers were artists, poets, and historians assigned to document the Great Crusade, to capture the glory of the Emperor's conquest of the galaxy for future generations. Serena was a painter, someone who saw the world through the lens of color and composition, form and symbolism. She had been watching Lucius, had seen something in him that went beyond simple martial prowess. Their first real conversation took place in her studio, a space filled with half-finished canvases depicting scenes from recent campaigns. Lucius had come to see her work, curious about how she captured the violence and glory of battle through mere pigment and canvas. What he found instead was someone who seemed to understand something fundamental about him, something that even he had not fully acknowledged. She spoke to him about perfection and how the pursuit of it could drive an artist to extremes. She showed him her own work, pointing out deliberate flaws she had introduced, imperfections that she claimed added depth and meaning, that pure technical excellence could never achieve. The scars that marked her subjects, she explained, told stories that unblemished skin never could. They were proof of experience, of survival, of the price paid for achievement. Then she offered to paint him, but not as he currently appeared. She wanted to mark him, to add to the scar that Loken had given him, to create a symmetry that would transform what he saw as a defect into something meaningful. She took up a blade, and before Lucius fully understood what was happening, she had cut 2 parallel lines across his cheeks, scars that framed his face and drew attention to, rather than away from, his broken nose. The pain was exquisite, a sharp burning that seemed to clarify his thoughts rather than cloud them. And as Serena stepped back to examine her work, as she smiled with satisfaction at what she had created, Lucius saw himself reflected in a mirror and understood what she had done. The scars were a transformation, a deliberate choice to mark himself rather than being marked by circumstance. They were a statement that he controlled his own image, his own body, his own destiny. More than that, that they served as permanent reminders of Loken's insult, ensuring that he would never forget, never allow himself to be caught off guard again. What Lucius did not know, what he could not have known, was that Serena herself had already been touched by corruption. Her artistic vision had been subtly influenced by forces from beyond the material realm, entities that fed on sensation and emotion, that sought to corrupt and claim the souls of mortals. In marking Lucius, in encouraging his obsession with perfection and his embrace of pain as a form of artistic expression, she was serving as a vector for something far more dangerous than mere artistic philosophy. Lucius began to scar himself regularly after this encounter. After each victory in battle, after each duel won, he would take a blade to his own flesh and cut a new mark. The pattern grew more elaborate over time, lines connecting to other lines, creating an intricate network across his face and body. To observers, it was disturbing behavior, a sign of psychological trauma or unhealthy obsession. To Lucius, it was a form of record-keeping, a physical manifestation of his journey toward perfection. Each scar represented a step forward, a challenge overcome, an enemy defeated. His fellow officers became increasingly concerned. Even those who admired his combat prowess found his behavior troubling. The self-mutilation, the obsessive record-keeping, the barely contained rage when anyone suggested that another warrior might be equally skilled, these were not the qualities of a stable commander. Saul Tarvitz, in particular, tried to reach his friend, tried to understand what had driven him to such extremes. But Lucius rebuffed these attempts at intervention. He saw concern as doubt, care as insult. If his brothers could not understand his pursuit of perfection, then that was their failing, not his. The taint spreads. While Lucius descended into his personal obsessions, larger forces were at work within the Emperor's Children Legion. The Primarch Fulgrim, the Gene Father who had shaped the Legion in his image, was embarking on his own dark journey. During a campaign against the alien species known as the Leia, Fulgrim had led his warriors into a temple dedicated to their gods. The Leia were serpentine Xenos who had built a civilization around the pursuit of pleasure and excess, who saw sensation and experience as the highest goods, who worshipped entities that fed on such emotions. Within the central chamber of that temple, Fulgrim discovered a sword of exquisite craftsmanship, a blade of silver metal with a gently curved edge and an amethyst gem set in its pommel. From the moment he grasped its hilt, something changed. The sword was not merely a weapon, but a prison, containing within it a fragment of a greater demon of Slanesh, the chaos god of excess and forbidden pleasure. This demon began to whisper to Fulgrim, subtle suggestions that played on the Primarch's pride and his legion's obsession with perfection. The corruption spread slowly at first, so subtly that even Fulgrim himself barely noticed the change. His standards for perfection became more extreme, his pursuit of excellence more obsessive, his tolerance for anything less than ideal vanished entirely. He began to see the Emperor's vision for humanity as limited, constrained by unnecessary restrictions on what Space Marines could become. The demon whispered of potential beyond imagining, of transformations that would elevate the Emperor's children to true perfection, of experiences and sensations that were being denied to them by the Emperor's rigid doctrines. The influence of the Leia's temple and the demon within the sword rippled through the entire Legion. warriors who had always pursued excellence found themselves pursuing excess instead. The line between dedication and obsession blurred and then vanished entirely. Practices that would once have been considered aberrant became acceptable, then celebrated. The emperor's children began to change, sometimes literally, as the corruptive influence of Slaanesh worked its way into their very flesh and souls. While Lucius felt these changes perhaps more keenly than most. His obsession with perfection, his embrace of pain as a form of artistic expression, his need for constant validation through combat, all of these made him particularly susceptible to what Slaanesh offered. The demon god of excess saw in Lucius a perfect champion, someone whose very nature aligned with the principles of sensation and experience, elevated to divine status. The swordsmanship that had defined Lucius began to take on new dimensions. Combat became not merely a test of skill, but an experience to be savored. The clash of blades, the spray of blood, the look of fear or respect in an opponent's eyes as they realized they were overmatched. These became almost narcotic in their appeal. Lucius found that he fought not merely to win, but to prolong the experience, has to extract maximum sensation from each encounter. A quick, efficient kill became unsatisfying compared to a drawn-out duel where he could demonstrate his superiority through 1,000 cuts rather than a single decisive blow. His weapon during this period was a master-crafted power sword he had named simply 19. The name reflected Lucius's philosophy toward his equipment. He cared little for the weapons themselves, seeing them as interchangeable tools that existed to serve him rather than as objects worthy of attachment or reverence in their own right. By giving them simple numerical designations, he ensured that no sword would ever achieve fame that might eclipse his own. The weapons were extensions of his will and skill, nothing more. Yet even as Lucius fell deeper into the patterns that would eventually damn him, a part of him remained loyal to the ideals he had sworn to uphold. The Emperor's children were still the Emperor's sons, still sworn to the Great Crusade, still dedicated to bringing the galaxy into compliance with human rule. When the War Master Horus revealed his treachery and called upon those legions who would stand with him against the Emperor, the Third Legion faced a choice that would define its future. The initial betrayal took place on Istvan III, a world that Horus had ostensibly been sent to bring into compliance, but which he actually used as a killing ground to purge his own forces of those he deemed potentially disloyal to his rebellion. The War Master's plan was brutally simple. He would deploy the loyalist elements of the 4 legions that had sworn allegiance to him, the Sons of Horus, the World Eaters, the Death Guard, Guan and the Emperor's children, to the planet's surface on what appeared to be a standard compliance action. Once they were committed to the surface battle, he would have the fleet bombard the planet with life-eater virus bombs, weapons of such horrific lethality that they would reduce all life on the world to basic organic sludge. Lucius was among those deployed to Istvan III's surface. The irony was that Horus and his fellow conspirators had actually misjudged where Lucius's loyalties would lie. They assumed that his friendship with Saul Tarvitz and his generally unstable personality made him a potential liability, someone who might reject the rebellion out of some misguided loyalty to terror. In reality, Lucius cared little for abstract ideals like loyalty to the Emperor or the nobility of the Great Crusade. What he cared about was excellence, achievement, and the opportunity to prove his superiority. The rebellion offered opportunities for all 3. The betrayal should have worked perfectly. The loyalist elements deployed to the surface, engaged the enemy, committed their forces to the campaign, and remained unaware of the doom descending from orbit. But a handful of warriors discovered the plot and managed to warn their brothers on the surface.
You know, when I first read about Lucius's curse, I thought it was just another overpowered chaos ability. But the more I've studied his lore, the more I realize how genuinely horrifying it actually is. This isn't a blessing at all. Think about it. Lucius can never have a true rematch with anyone who beats him. Every worthy opponent who proves superior just becomes another screaming face in his armor. He's literally denied the one thing that might give his existence meaning, the chance to learn from defeat and come back stronger through his own skill. And what really gets me is that Slaanesh designed this perfectly. For a warrior whose entire identity is built on being the best swordsman, the curse ensures he can never actually prove it. Anyone who defeats him gets absorbed, so the victory doesn't count. It's like being given immortality by having it strip away the very thing that made you want to live forever in the first place. That's the kind of twisted irony that makes Warhammer 40k's Chaos Gods so terrifyingly well written. They give you exactly what you ask for, and it destroys you. But anyways, let's continue the video.
Saul Tarvitz was among these heroes, stealing a Thunderhawk gunship and racing to the planet below to spread word of the impending bombardment. Thanks to his warning, approximately 2/3 of the deployed forces managed to find shelter before the Life Eater virus was released. Lucius survived the bombardment in one of the sealed bunkers that dotted Istvan III. As the virus transformed the world above into a charnel house, as billions died in the most agonizing way imaginable, as the very air became toxic with death, he found himself trapped underground with his fellow survivors. And here, a crisis of identity occurred. Lucius had been betrayed by his Primarch, cast aside as disposable, deemed unworthy to participate in the grand rebellion that Fulgrim was leading. This rejection cut deeper than any blade. He had dedicated his life to perfecting himself, to becoming the finest warrior the Emperor's children could produce, and in return, he had been marked for death like some expendable line trooper. For days and then weeks, Lucius fought alongside Saul Tarvitz and the other loyalists. They defended their positions against wave after wave of traitor forces, now holding impossible odds through skill and determination. Tarvitz proved himself the tactical genius that Lucius had always suspected he might be, organizing the defense, inspiring the troops, turning what should have been a slaughter into a protracted siege that tied down forces Horus desperately needed elsewhere. And as Tarvitz's legend grew, as the loyalist defenders began to see him as their champion and leader, Lucius felt a familiar emotion building within him: jealousy. Here was Saul Tarvitz, solid and dependable Tarvitz, unremarkable Tarvitz, receiving accolades and recognition that Lucius believed should be his by right. Every tactical victory was attributed to Tarvitz's genius. Every successful defense was credited to his leadership. As the loyalist space marines from 4 different legions looked to Tarvitz for guidance and inspiration. And where did that leave Lucius? He was the superior swordsman, the more skilled warrior, the one who had achieved perfection in combat arts. Yet it was Tarvitz who had become the hero of the hour. The resentment grew with each passing day. Lucius told himself that it was unfair, that Tarvitz's success was based on circumstances rather than merit, that anyone could organize a defense when all they had to do was hold a position. Real skill, real excellence, was demonstrated in individual combat, in the purity of blade against blade, warrior against warrior. Tarvitz's growing fame was built on the efforts of others, on the collective strength of the loyalist defenders. Lucius's achievements were his own. He earned through personal excellence rather than by leading others. But the galaxy, it seemed, cared more about who won than how they won. And in the grinding siege warfare of Istvan III, organizational skill and tactical acumen mattered more than individual combat prowess. Lucius could kill a dozen enemy champions in single combat, and it would mean less to the overall defense than one of Tarvitz's well-planned ambushes that destroyed an entire enemy company. The final betrayal came when Lucius made a choice that would define the rest of his eternal existence. He was assigned to command a defensive position with 30 loyal Marines under his command. These warriors trusted him, followed his orders, looked to him for leadership in desperate circumstances. Oh, what they did not know was that Lucius had established contact with the traitor forces beyond their lines. He had made a bargain. When the attack came, Lucius turned on his own men. He struck from behind, cutting down warriors who had no reason to suspect treachery from their commanding officer. The fight was brutal and one-sided. These Marines were skilled, but they had not expected to be fighting their own captain. Lucius exploited every advantage. used his superior speed and technique to cut them down before they could properly organize a defense. Captain Solomon Demeter arrived during the slaughter. Demeter had never gotten along well with Lucius, had always found something disturbing about the swordsman's obsessive nature and cruel streak. When he saw Lucius fighting what appeared to be a group of traitor marines, yet he assumed the obvious explanation. Lucius's forces had been infiltrated or had turned traitor themselves, and Lucius was fighting desperately to put them down. Demeter joined the fight without hesitation, his blade adding to the carnage. It was only after the last of the 30 marines had fallen that Demeter realized the truth. The way Lucius moved, the precision with which he had struck, the fact that all 30 warriors bore wounds that could only have come from behind, it painted a picture that Demeter found almost too horrible to believe. These had not been traitors. They had been loyal sons of the emperor, and Lucius had murdered them all. The two captains faced each other over the bodies of the slain. Demeter, already wounded from the recent fighting, knew he was outmatched. Lucius was fresh and uninjured, while Demeter had been fighting at the walls for hours before arriving at this position. But knowledge of defeat did not mean acceptance of it. Demeter attacked with everything he had, determined to make Lucius pay for his treachery even if it cost him his life. The duel was short and brutal. Lucius played with Demeter, demonstrating his superiority with casual ease. Every attack was deflected, every desperate lunge was countered, every attempt to land a blow was punished with a cut that drew blood without being immediately lethal. Lucius drew out Demeter's death, wanting the captain to understand fully how outmatched he had always been, how the gulf between their skills had never been bridgeable. When he finally delivered the killing stroke, it was almost a mercy compared to the humiliation that had preceded it. With 30 loyalist marines and Captain Demeter dead by his hand, Lucius had earned his place among the traitors. He made contact with Lord Commander Eidolon of the Emperor's Children and arranged for his reintegration into the traitor legion. There was a price to pay, of course. He would have to prove his loyalty to the rebellion, demonstrate that his treachery was not some ploy to infiltrate their ranks. Eidolon demanded that Lucius face Saul Tarvitz in single combat, that he kill the man who had once been his closest friend. The confrontation took place in the ruins of one of Istvan III's shattered cities. Tarvitz had suspected Lucius's treachery even before it was confirmed, had felt the change in his old friend, had seen the jealousy and resentment building. Or when they finally faced each other across a stretch of rubble-strewn ground, there was a moment of profound sadness. This was not how it should have ended. They were supposed to be brothers, warriors fighting side by side for a cause greater than themselves. But that possibility had died long before they crossed blades. The Tarvitz who faced Lucius was fighting not just for his own life, but for the ideal of loyalty itself, for the belief that duty and honor meant something even in the face of betrayal. The Lucius who faced Tarvitz was fighting to prove that skill mattered more than loyalty, that excellence in combat was its own justification, that power determined what was right rather than some abstract moral code. The duel was everything Lucius had imagined it might be, and Tarvitz fought with the steady competence that had always characterized his approach to combat, disciplined and controlled, seeking openings rather than forcing them. Lucius fought with the flash and brilliance that had made him legendary, demonstrating techniques and combinations that few could have defended against. To outside observers, it might have appeared that Lucius dominated the engagement, that Tarvitz was clearly outmatched. But Lucius knew better. Tarvitz was not trying to defeat him through superior swordsmanship. Tarvitz was fighting to survive, to deny Lucius the clean victory that would validate his betrayal. Every second the duel continued was a statement that Lucius had not achieved the overwhelming superiority he believed he possessed. When Tarvitz scored touches of his own, or when his blade found gaps in Lucius's defense, it was a reminder that for all his skill, Lucius was not invincible. The conclusion shocked everyone who witnessed it. Tarvitz, through a combination of solid technique and sheer determination, managed to defeat Lucius in their duel. It was not a crushing victory, not a demonstration of clear superiority. but a win nonetheless. Lucius, the finest swordsman in the Emperor's children, had been bested by steadfast Saul Tarvitz. The humiliation burned worse than any physical wound. Lucius fled the field, denied even the consolation of having proven his worth to the traitors who had accepted him. He retreated to the traitor lines alone, bearing the knowledge that in attempting to demonstrate his superiority over Tarvitz, he had instead proven the opposite. What the traitors accepted him regardless, his massacre of the 30 loyalist Marines had proven his commitment to their cause. But the sting of defeat at Tarvitz's hands remained. Tarvitz, for his part, took no particular pleasure in his victory. He had defeated a brother who had fallen to treachery and obsession, and there was no joy in that accomplishment. He returned to organizing the loyalist defense, continuing the futile but noble resistance that would eventually end with the complete destruction of the defenders. But he had made his point. Skill alone did not determine worth. Character mattered. Loyalty mattered. And sometimes, the simple warrior who did his duty was worth more than the brilliant prodigy who had no sense of honor. For Lucius, the defeat at Tarvitz's hands became another scar. This one psychological rather than physical. It joined the broken nose from Loken as a reminder that for all his pursuit of perfection, he remained flawed. These wounds to his pride would fester and grow, feeding the corruption that Slaanesh had been cultivating within him. The path to damnation was being paved, and Lucius walked it with increasing speed. The Demon's Blade. After the Istvan III, atrocity had run its course, and the traitors had finally crushed the last pockets of loyalist resistance. Lucius found himself fully integrated into the Emperor's children as they continued their descent into depravity. The legion that had once prided itself on perfection and artistic excellence had become something else entirely. A war band dedicated to the pursuit of sensation and excess in all its forms. Where once they had sought perfection in combat, they now sought the perfect experience of violence. Where once they had appreciated beauty, they now craved extremes of aesthetic experience that pushed beyond anything recognizable as art into pure sensory overload. Lucius thrived in this new environment. His obsession with dueling, his embrace of pain as a form of expression, his need to mark himself with scars after each victory. All of these behaviors that had once seemed disturbing were now celebrated as signs of his devotion to the pursuit of perfection through excess. He rose rapidly through the ranks, his combat prowess earning him command of elite assault squads and eventually leadership of Fulgrim's bodyguard. It was during this period that Fulgrim himself took notice of Lucius's potential, as the Primarch had by now been fully possessed by the greater demon that had been imprisoned within the Blade of Leia. His body remained that of the magnificent Primarch, but his mind and soul had been forced into a prison in a corner of his own consciousness, while the demon wielded his form like a puppet. This demon Fulgrim saw in Lucius someone who could serve as a champion, a mortal who embodied the principles of Slaanesh even before fully understanding what that god represented. After the drop site massacre on Istvan V, where the Emperor's children and their fellow traitor legions annihilated 3 loyalist legions in a perfectly executed ambush, Fulgrim called Lucius to him. The possessed Primarch studied the swordsman with eyes that saw beyond the material realm, and perceiving the corruption that had already taken root in Lucius's soul, the potential for him to become something truly extraordinary in the service of the Dark Prince. Fulgrim presented Lucius with a gift, the Blade of Leia itself. This was the sword that had been the instrument of Fulgrim's fall, the weapon that had housed the demon that now wore the Primarch's flesh. With the demon freed from its prison within the blade to inhabit a far more powerful form, the sword was now merely an exquisite weapon of Xenos craftsmanship, no longer the prison of a greater demon, but still a potent symbol of the Legion's fall to chaos. The blade was a work of art, its single edge curved in gentle sweeps that spoke of alien aesthetics, its silver metal seemingly capable of holding a perfect edge without any maintenance. It's where Lucius had always treated his weapons as disposable tools, numbering them rather than naming them to ensure they never developed reputations that might overshadow his own. This sword was different. It represented Fulgrim's favor, the Primarch's acknowledgement that Lucius was worthy to wield a weapon that had been wielded by one of the Emperor's sons himself. Lucius accepted the blade with reverence that was unusual for someone who normally disdained attachment to mere objects. From the moment his hand closed around the grip, he felt the connection. The sword seemed to respond to his intentions with perfect precision, becoming an extension of his will in ways that even the finest master-crafted weapons had never achieved. In battle, it moved like quicksilver, its edge parting armor and flesh with equal ease, and its balance so perfect that complex techniques became effortless. The Primarch's gift came with expectations. Lucius was to be tested, to prove himself worthy of the favor that had been shown him. The Emperor's children were embarking on a campaign that would take them to the edge of known space and beyond, a quest for something called the Angel Exterminatus. This was a weapon of such legendary power that even the ancient Eldari had feared it, sealing it away in the Eye of Terror itself. Perturabo, Primarch of the Iron Warriors, had been convinced to join this expedition, though he believed they were seeking to activate and control the weapon rather than become its sacrifice. And it was during this campaign that Lucius encountered an enemy who would teach him the meaning of true humility in a way that even his defeats by Loken and Tarvitz had not. Nikona Sharokin of the Raven Guard was a warrior trained in the art of wraith-slipping, able to move through shadows as if he were one himself, a master of stealth and precision that went beyond even the considerable skills of a normal space marine. He had survived the drop site massacre through a combination of skill and luck, and had joined the crew of the Sisypheum, a legendary Iron Hand strike cruiser whose surviving crew had sworn to continue fighting the traitors no matter the odds. The Sisypheum's crew discovered the expedition's true purpose and moved to interfere, and Sharokin and his battle brother Sabik Wayland managed to infiltrate a gathering where Fulgrim was explaining his plans. Sharokin demonstrated his extraordinary skill by shooting Fulgrim in the head with a sniper rifle, a feat that should have been impossible given the reflexes and awareness of a Primarch. The wound was not fatal. Fabius Bile, the Emperor's children's chief apothecary, was able to extract the projectile and heal the damage, but it served as proof that even beings of Fulgrim's power were not invulnerable. The traitor forces pursued the Sisypheum to the dead Eldari world of Idris, where the Angel Exterminatus was supposedly located. During the battle aboard the Loyalist ship, Lucius and Sharokin crossed blades for the first time. It was meant to be a brief encounter, a skirmish during a larger boarding action. But even in those few moments of combat, Lucius found himself challenged in ways he had not expected. Sharokin fought with a style unlike anything Lucius had encountered before, combining the precision of a duel with the ruthless pragmatism of an assassin. The Raven Guard gave Lucius a scar across one cheek, a mark that matched the scars Serena de Angelis had given him years before, though from a very different source. The second encounter took place on Idris itself. Sharokin sought out Lucius deliberately, isolating him from the larger battle for a confrontation that would be personal rather than tactical. Lucius welcomed the challenge, saw it as an opportunity to avenge the insult of their first meeting and prove his superiority over this sneaking loyalist who relied on shadows rather than honest combat. They fought in the ruins of an Eldari settlement, surrounded by structures that had stood for millennia before humanity had even discovered fire. Lucius fought with all the skill and artistry that had made him legendary, employing the Blade of Leia with techniques that showcased both his natural talent and the superior quality of his weapon. Every movement was precise, every strike calculated, every combination flowing seamlessly into the next. To any observer, it would have appeared that Lucius was dominating the encounter, pushing Sharokin back through superior speed and technical excellence. But Sharokin was not fighting to win an honorable duel. He was fighting to eliminate a target, and he brought to bear every advantage that the Raven Guard had taught him. and his twin black gladiae moved in patterns that seemed to defy prediction, attacking from angles that shouldn't have been available, exploiting openings that appeared to exist for only microseconds. Where Lucius fought with flash and brilliance, Sharokin fought with cold efficiency. The turning point came when Sharokin gave Lucius the matching scar on his other cheek, symmetry to complement the mark from their first encounter. The pain was unexpected and exquisite, a burning sensation that should have been familiar given Lucius's history of self-scarification, but somehow felt different when inflicted by an enemy's blade. And then, before Lucius could capitalize on what he thought was an opening, before he could deliver what should have been the decisive counterstroke, he felt a blade plunge into his side. The sensation was incredible, a pain beyond anything he had experienced even in his most extreme moments of self-mutilation. Lucius twisted away from the blade, feeling it slide free from his flesh, blood flowing hot down his side. His vision cleared in time to see Sharokin behind him. When had he gotten behind him? And he spun to defend against the next attack, but his blade cut only air. Sharokin had moved again, seemed to flow through space like water, finding the path of least resistance. Another blade struck, this time penetrating his back, and the pain was simultaneously unwelcome and fascinating. Lucius had always viewed pain as a form of artistic expression when self-inflicted, proof of his dedication and discipline. But this pain, inflicted by an enemy who clearly bested him, carried a very different meaning. This was the pain of defeat, of being outmatched, of facing an opponent who possessed skills that Lucius could not counter. Sharokin pressed his advantage with ruthless efficiency. His blades found Lucius again and again, each strike precise and devastating. There was no gloating, no theatrical flourishes, no attempt to prolong the encounter for maximum dramatic effect. Sharokin fought like what he was, an assassin executing a target. When Lucius finally stumbled, his legs no longer responding properly, Sharokin moved in for the killing blow. The twin gladii plunged through Lucius's gorget, the weak point where his armor's neck protection met his chest plate. They pierced both of his hearts with surgical precision, the organs that kept a space marine alive even through catastrophic damage. Lucius felt his life draining away, felt his consciousness fading, as his enhanced biology struggled and failed to cope with such grievous injury. His last sight was Sharokin standing over him, blades dripping with Lucius's blood, face expressionless behind his helmet. The Raven Guard spoke only a single sentence before turning away from Lucius's dying form. "I take no pleasure in this. You're just a rabid dog who needs to be put down." Then there was darkness, and Lucius the Eternal died for the first time. Death should have been the end. For any normal warrior, even a space marine with all their enhanced biology and redundant organs, wounds like those Sharokin had inflicted would have been absolutely fatal. Both hearts destroyed, massive blood loss, damage to critical organs, and major blood vessels. These were injuries from which no recovery was possible. Lucius's body was recovered by the Emperor's children after the battle, carried to Fabius Bile's apothecarian aboard the flagship. Bile examined the corpse with clinical detachment, noting the precision of the wounds, the skill required to deliver such killing blows. By all rights, Lucius was dead and should have remained so. But Fabius Bile was no ordinary apothecary. Over the course of the Horus heresy, he had delved deeply into forbidden sciences, exploring the boundaries of biology and medicine in ways that violated every principle of the Mechanicum. He had begun to understand that death was not necessarily permanent, that the barrier between life and extinction could be crossed under certain circumstances. When Fulgrim, or more accurately, the demon wearing Fulgrim's form, brought Lucius's corpse to him and demanded that he restore the fallen warrior to life, Bile saw it as an opportunity to test theories he had been developing. The process Bile used to resurrect Lucius was never fully documented. It involved techniques that blurred the line between science and sorcery, between medicine and necromancy. Bile worked for days on the lifeless flesh, replacing damaged organs with augmetics and carefully cloned tissues, restarting the hearts, restoring the complex interplay of enhanced biology that made a space marine more than human. But the body was only part of the equation. Somehow, either through Bile's skill or through the intervention of forces beyond the material realm, Lucius's consciousness was called back from whatever realm dead souls inhabit. While Lucius awoke in Fabius's apothecarium, initially confused and disoriented, unable to fully process what had happened, the last thing he remembered was Sharokin's blades piercing his heart, the sensation of life draining away, the darkness closing in. Now he was breathing again, his heart beating, his enhanced physiology functioning despite injuries that should have been fatal. The scars from Sharokin's blades remained, adding to the elaborate network of marks that covered his body, permanent reminders of his defeat. What neither Fabius nor Lucius initially understood was that this resurrection was not simply the result of the apothecary's skill. Forces beyond the material realm had taken an interest in Lucius, had seen potential in him that went beyond mortal achievement. Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess and forbidden sensation, had been watching Lucius's descent into obsession and corruption with approval. Here was a soul that exemplified the principles the Dark Prince embodied, the pursuit of perfection taken to obsessive extremes, the embrace of sensation both pleasurable and painful, the need for constant validation through achievement and recognition. The resurrection on Bile's operating table was merely the first step. Slaanesh had plans for Lucius, plans that would transform him from merely a skilled swordsman into something that would become legendary across the galaxy. But these plans would unfold over time, through battles and deaths yet to come. For now, Lucius was simply grateful to be alive, even if he did not fully understand the mechanisms that had brought him back from death's embrace. The defeat at Sharokin's hands, however, left psychological scars far deeper than any physical wounds. Lucius had been bested comprehensively, killed by an opponent who had taken no satisfaction in the victory, who had viewed eliminating him as simply a necessary task rather than a significant achievement. It was, in its way, more humiliating than his defeats by Loken or Tarvitz. At least they had been significant warriors in their own right. Sharokin was just a line Astartes, not even a captain or champion, yet he had killed Lucius with apparent ease. The humiliation drove Lucius to even greater extremes in his pursuit of martial perfection. He trained obsessively, pushing his abilities to their limits and beyond. He sought out the greatest warriors in the traitor legions and challenged them to duels, needing to prove to himself that Sharokin's victory had been a fluke, an accident, a result of circumstances rather than a true demonstration of superior skill. Most of these challenges ended with Lucius victorious, but the victories brought less satisfaction than they once had. In the back of his mind lurked the knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy there was a Raven Guard who had killed him and felt nothing but contempt in doing so. The Dark Prince's gift. As the Horus heresy ground toward its catastrophic conclusion and the traitors began their assault on the Sol system itself, the Emperor's children found themselves pulled in directions that had little to do with the actual goal of overthrowing the Emperor. Fulgrim's obsession with sensation and experience had led the Legion into pursuits that served no strategic purpose, and campaigns launched simply because they promised interesting experiences or novel forms of excess. The demon wearing the Primarch's flesh cared nothing for Horus's grand strategy, interested only in feeding the endless hunger of Slaanesh. Lucius accompanied his brothers on these campaigns of pointless excess, participating in battles that achieved nothing beyond the accumulation of sensory experience. The Emperor's children attacked worlds that had no strategic value, slaughtered populations that posed no threat, engaged in conflicts that served no purpose other than the pursuit of perfect violence. And through it all, Lucius continued to duel, to fight, to accumulate victories that added new scars to his already marked flesh. After the heresy ended in failure and the traitor legions fled into the Eye of Terror, the Emperor's children scattered into warbands. The rigid hierarchies that had once defined the Legion dissolved into loose associations based on shared obsessions and complementary madnesses. Fulgrim retreated to a demon world of his own creation. leaving his sons to pursue their own paths to damnation. Some became noise marines, warriors who weaponized sound itself, finding ecstasy in the perfect scream that could shatter bone and rupture organs. Others descended into pharmaceutical experimentation, seeking the ultimate sensory experience through combinations of combat drugs and stimulants. Still others pursued artistic expressions so extreme that they crossed into pure horror. Lucius found his place organizing gladiatorial combat for the legion's entertainment. Fulgrim was when he could be bothered to pay attention to the material realm at all, would occasionally host grand spectacles where the finest warriors from across the Emperor's children would compete. These were not mere fights, but theatrical performances, displays of skill and sadism that served both as entertainment and as religious devotion to Slaanesh. The audience for these contests included not just the Emperor's children, but entities from the warp itself, demons drawn to the spectacle of mortal warriors, pushing themselves to extremes of violence and artistry. Lucius was undefeated in these contests for a long period. His skill with the blade of Leia and his absolute mastery of swordsmanship proving too much for any challenger. He fought with a style that combined technical perfection with theatrical flair, at ensuring that each victory was not merely a demonstration of superior skill, but a performance worthy of being remembered. The scars that covered his body served as a living record of these victories, each mark representing a duel won, a champion defeated, a moment of perfection achieved. It was during one of these contests that Lucius faced Lord Commander Sirius. Sirius was a veteran of the Long War, a warrior who had fought through the Horus heresy and the desperate battles that followed the Legion's retreat into the Eye of Terror. He wore artificer armor of exquisite craftsmanship, each piece individually tailored and decorated with the symbols of the Emperor's children. His skill with a blade was considerable. They are honed through centuries of combat against enemies ranging from loyalist space marines to the nightmarish entities that dwelt in the warp. The duel between Lucius and Sirius was intended to be the highlight of that particular gladiatorial spectacle. Both warriors were champions of note, representatives of the Emperor's children's martial excellence. The audience settled in to watch what promised to be an epic confrontation, a battle that would showcase the finest techniques and most dramatic moments of blade work imaginable. What they witnessed instead became something far more significant, though in ways that no one could have predicted. The fight itself was magnificent, both warriors demonstrating skills that few could match. Lucius fought with his characteristic combination of precision and showmanship, employing techniques that he had perfected over years of constant combat. Sirius met him stroke for stroke, his own style more conservative but no less effective, focused on defense and patient counterattacks rather than Lucius's aggressive combinations. The contest seemed evenly matched for a time, both warriors probing for weaknesses, testing the other's defenses, searching for the opening that would allow a decisive strike. Then Sirius saw his moment. Perhaps Lucius was slightly off balance. Perhaps he committed fractionally too much to an attack. Perhaps the gods themselves arranged circumstances to create the opportunity. Whatever the reason, Sirius's blade found the gap in Lucius's defenses and struck home. The wound was mortal, even for a space marine. Sirius's blade had penetrated deep into Lucius's chest, causing massive trauma to critical organs. Lucius fell, his body already beginning to shut down as his enhanced biology struggled to cope with catastrophic damage. He died there on the gladiatorial floor, his blood pooling around him, his last sight the ecstatic face of Sirius standing over him in triumph. For Sirius, the victory was the pinnacle of his existence. He had defeated Lucius the Eternal, the finest swordsman in the Emperor's children, in fair combat before an audience of his peers and his gods. The sensation of that moment was overwhelming. The satisfaction of a difficult victory earned, the pride of achievement recognized, the pleasure of having proven himself superior to one who had seemed unbeatable. It was, in its way, a perfect moment, or the crystallization of everything that Sirius had worked toward throughout his long service to the Legion. Slaanesh felt Sirius's satisfaction and smiled, if such an entity can be said to smile. Here was the perfect opportunity to demonstrate both divine power and divine cruelty. Lucius had been marked for special favor, had shown such dedication to the pursuit of perfection through excess that he warranted particular attention, and the mechanism of his return would serve as both blessing and curse, ensuring that he could never truly die while simultaneously denying him the possibility of honorable defeat. Over the course of the following weeks, Sirius began to change. It started small, lines appearing on his skin, patterns that he could not remember seeing before. His hair began to fall out in clumps, leaving him increasingly bald. He felt strange sensations, as if his body no longer quite belonged to him, as if something else was moving beneath his skin. The victory over Lucius, which should have remained a treasured memory, became an obsession that consumed his every waking thought. The transformation accelerated. The lines on Sirius's skin deepened into scars, replicating the intricate network that had covered Lucius's body. His features began to shift and distort, taking on characteristics that were distinctly not his own. His armor began to warp and change, metal flowing like water to reshape itself into new configurations. And through it all, Sirius remained conscious, aware of what was happening, but powerless to stop it. The process culminated when Lucius emerged fully, his consciousness having somehow consumed and replaced Sirius's own. All that remained of the Lord Commander was a screaming face embedded in Lucius's armor, a tortured visage that would serve as an eternal reminder of what happened to those who defeated Lucius and took satisfaction in the achievement. Sirius's awareness remained, trapped in the armor, forced to experience everything that happened to Lucius, while being completely unable to influence or control any of it. His perfect moment of victory had become an eternity of torment. Lucius awoke in his new/old body with full memory of what had happened. He had died, truly and completely died, and through some mechanism he did not fully understand, he had returned. The armor he wore now bore Sirius's screaming face, along with all the other scars and marks that had defined Lucius's appearance. He understood, on some instinctive level, that this transformation was related to Sirius's satisfaction in defeating him, that the very pride the Lord Commander had felt in his victory had become the mechanism of Lucius's resurrection. The implications were staggering. If the pattern held, if this was not a unique occurrence, but rather a repeatable process, then Lucius had been granted a form of immortality beyond anything the Chaos Gods normally bestowed on their champions. He could die, could be killed in fair combat, or through ambush, or by any means imaginable, and as long as his killer felt even the slightest satisfaction in the achievement, Lucius would return. The killer's body would become his new vessel. Their consciousness would be subsumed into his armor as another screaming face, and Lucius would continue on as if death had been merely a temporary inconvenience. And it was Slaanesh's gift to his champion, a blessing that reflected the Dark Prince's nature perfectly. Lucius would indeed become eternal, unable to truly die, a warrior who could face any opponent without fear of permanent defeat. But the gift came with a terrible price. Every death, every defeat, every moment of being bested by another warrior would result in that opponent being consumed and becoming part of Lucius. He would never have the opportunity to face them again, to earn revenge through legitimate victory, to prove that his initial defeat had been a fluke. Instead, they would simply become another face in his armor, another voice screaming in his mind, another reminder of failure that could never be rectified. For someone like Lucius, whose entire identity was built around being the finest swordsman imaginable, yet this curse gift was exquisitely cruel. He was granted immortality but denied the thing that made victory meaningful, the possibility of eventual defeat if he failed to maintain his excellence. He could never again face worthy opponents on equal terms, because defeating him would doom them to absorption into his armor. The greatest warriors in the galaxy would either avoid challenging him, or, if they did defeat him, would be denied any lasting satisfaction in their achievement. The blessing also had another consequence that became apparent over time. The faces trapped in Lucius's armor were not silent. They screamed constantly, their voices audible to Lucius alone. Each one represented a warrior who had bested him, whose skills had proven superior in that moment of combat. Their screams were reminders of his failures, and of moments when he had not been perfect, when his technique had proven insufficient. As more faces joined the chorus over the centuries, the cacophony became overwhelming, a constant assault on Lucius's sanity that could only be silenced through the perfect focus required in combat. 10 millennia of dying. The years that followed Lucius's transformation into the Eternal became a blur of battles, deaths, and resurrections. He threw himself into combat with reckless abandon, seeking out the finest warriors in the galaxy and challenging them to duels. The outcome was almost preordained. Either Lucius would prove superior and add another victory to his record, or he would die and the curse would claim his killer. There was no possibility of honorable defeat, no chance for a worthy opponent to earn lasting recognition for besting him. But the pattern repeated itself across millennia. Lucius would find a champion worth fighting, someone whose skill or reputation suggested they might provide a genuine challenge. They would duel, and if Lucius lost, weeks or months later, he would awaken having consumed his killer. A new face would join the hundreds or thousands already screaming in his armor, and Lucius would continue his endless quest for the perfect opponent, the perfect duel, the perfect moment of combat. He fought elder exarchs on craftworlds hanging in the void, warriors who had dedicated themselves so completely to the art of war that they had become trapped in their war aspects, unable to ever truly know peace again. Their speed and precision challenged even Lucius's considerable abilities, and more than once he fell to their power swords or singing spears. But the curse claimed them regardless, adding Xenos voices to the human screams that filled his armor. He faced orc war bosses on their ramshackle war hulks, massive greenskins whose size and strength were matched by a crude but effective fighting style. The orcs cared nothing for finesse or technique, overwhelming opponents through sheer ferocity and unnatural toughness. Some of these massive brutes managed to kill Lucius through the simple expedient of hitting him hard enough and often enough that even his enhanced biology couldn't cope. But the satisfaction they felt in crushing another strong opponent was sufficient to trigger the curse, and Lucius would emerge from the war boss's transformed body, adding green-skinned faces to his collection of defeats. In the dark city of Komorra, he fought in the gladiatorial arenas of the Drukhari, the dark cousins of the craft world Eldar who had embraced torture and excess as a way of life. Here, at least, he found kindred spirits of a sort, beings who understood the pursuit of perfect sensation through violence. The Drukhari champions he faced were skilled beyond measure, their fighting styles honed over centuries of constant combat in the arenas. One particular Archon defeated him in single combat, feeling a moment of smug satisfaction at having bested a Monkey champion. That moment of pride was enough, and Lucius returned, though the process of emerging from a Drukhari body was apparently more complicated than from human or even orc flesh. The curse's mechanics became clearer through these repeated resurrections. But the key factor was not the manner of death or the skill of the killer, but rather the emotional state of the person who had delivered the killing blow. If they felt satisfaction, pride, pleasure, or any positive emotion regarding their victory, the curse would activate. Lucius would die, truly and completely. But Slaanesh would reach across the void and transform the killer into a new vessel for his champion's consciousness. This created interesting edge cases that tested the limits of the blessing. When Lucius was killed by a falling building during a siege, he initially feared he might finally have found true death. Architecture, after all, feels no satisfaction in killing. But the curse found a target regardless, reaching across the Imperium to claim the artilleryman whose shells had brought down the building. The man had felt satisfaction in a successful shot, pride in his targeting accuracy. pleasure in contributing to the battle's outcome. That was enough, and Lucius returned. The incident with the Necron duelist, known only as the phasing sword, became legendary within the forces of chaos. Necrons, ancient machines wearing bodies of living metal, had no souls to corrupt, no emotions to feed the warp. They were antithetical to chaos in every way, existing as creatures of pure physical law unmarred by the influence of the Imperium. When Lucius faced the phasing sword on a nameless moon, he was confident that even if he lost, the curse would fail against such an opponent. The duel was brief and brutal. The phasing sword's ability to shift between dimensions mid-strike made it almost impossible to defend against, yet its blade appearing inside Lucius's defenses, as if teleporting through the intervening space. Lucius died for what he thought might be the final time, his consciousness fading with almost a sense of relief that the eternal cycle might finally be ending. But even the Necron was not immune to the curse. The phasing sword had taken a cold, calculated pride in its victory, had felt satisfaction in its tactical analysis and execution of the killing blow. That emotion, however alien and mechanical it might have been, was sufficient anchor for Slaanesh's power. Lucius awoke in a body of living metal, the Necron's consciousness subsumed into the armor as another screaming face, this one rendered in metal rather than flesh. It was perhaps the most dramatic proof that the curse transcended normal biological limitations, that Slaanesh's reach extended even to beings that should have been beyond the Chaos God's influence. With each resurrection, Lucius found himself changing in subtle ways. The faces in his armor multiplied, their constant screaming becoming a cacophony that filled his every waking moment. His sanity, never particularly stable to begin with, eroded under the assault of thousands of voices, all crying out in eternal torment. He began to lose track of time, finding gaps in his memory where months or even years had passed without him fully registering their passage. The only moments of clarity, the only times when the screaming quieted and his mind achieved something like peace, were when he was fully engaged in combat. The focus required to fight at the highest level, the total commitment of body and mind to the immediate present. It pushed everything else aside. In those moments of perfect concentration, when blade met blade, and every fiber of his being was dedicated to reading his opponent and responding to their attacks, Lucius found silence. The faces stopped screaming, the voices faded to background noise, and he experienced the pure satisfaction of doing what he had been created to do. This realization only drove him to seek combat more desperately. Between battles, the screaming was unbearable, the weight of accumulated failures crushing. But in the heat of a duel, when death was a heartbeat away and survival demanded absolute perfection, Lucius found the peace that eluded him in all other circumstances. As he became addicted to combat, not just for the satisfaction of victory, but for the temporary relief it provided from his own thoughts and the accusations of those he had killed. His warband, eventually organized under the name the Faultless, became a vehicle for pursuing this endless need for combat. He gathered other emperors' children around him, warriors who shared his obsession with perfection through excess, who understood the need to constantly test themselves against worthy opponents. Under his leadership, they roamed the galaxy seeking the finest warriors available, launching raids and challenges for no purpose other than to identify champions worthy of Lucius's personal attention. As the Faultless developed a reputation across the galaxy as a warband that fought not for territory or resources, but purely for the sake of combat itself. When they descended upon a world, they would ignore strategic targets and civilian populations, seeking instead the defender's finest warriors. Lucius would issue challenges, demanding that champions step forward to face him in single combat. Those who accepted usually died. Those who proved skilled enough to actually defeat Lucius became part of him, their faces joining the crowd that adorned his armor. Over the 10 millennia since the Horus heresy, Lucius accumulated victories that numbered in the thousands. He defeated Space Marine captains and champions from both loyalist and traitor legions. He killed aspect warriors and exarchs from numerous craft worlds, and he bested chaos champions dedicated to the other dark gods, proving that Slaaneish's favor granted advantages even against servants of Khorne's rage or Nurgle's endurance. He fought human duelists, abhuman warriors, minor Xenos champions, and even the occasional greater demon reckless enough to accept his challenge. Each victory added another scar to his collection, another mark to commemorate achievement. But the scars were no longer purely self-inflicted wounds chosen to mark moments of triumph. Now they were mixed with scars from genuine defeats, reminders of times when his skill had proven insufficient. The network of marks covering his body became so dense that it was difficult to find unmarked flesh, his entire form a canvas depicting the violent history of his existence. The blessing that Slaanesh had bestowed upon him was revealed to be as much curse as gift. Yes, Lucius was functionally immortal, unable to be permanently killed as long as anyone took satisfaction in defeating him. But the price for this immortality was profound. He could never face a worthy opponent in a true rematch, could never avenge his defeats through honest victory, could never prove that his losses had been flukes or the result of unfavorable circumstances. Each death was both temporary and permanent. Temporary in that it did not end his existence, permanent in that it ended any possibility of rectifying the defeat through skill rather than divine intervention. Moreover, the curse made it increasingly difficult to find opponents willing to face him. Word spread of what happened to those who defeated Lucius, of the horrible transformation that awaited anyone who bested him in combat. Warriors who might have welcomed the challenge began to refuse it, unwilling to risk their souls for a moment of glory. Those who did accept were either foolishly ignorant of the consequences or so confident in their ability to defeat Lucius without satisfaction that they believed they could beat both the swordsman and the curse. A few actually succeeded in this impossible task. Nikona Sharokin had been the first, killing Lucius on Idris while feeling nothing but contempt for his target. When Lucius later researched what had become of the Raven Guard, he discovered that Sharokin had survived the heresy and gone on to further service. The curse had not claimed him because his victory had brought no satisfaction, only the grim acknowledgement that a dangerous enemy had been eliminated. This knowledge gnawed at Lucius more than any of his defeats that had resulted in resurrection. Sharokin remained out there somewhere, the one who got away, the warrior who had killed him and escaped the curse's reach. There were a handful of others over the millennia, warriors disciplined or alien enough that defeating Lucius brought them no emotional satisfaction. These few understood on some level that pride in victory was a trap, that any positive feeling about besting Lucius would doom them. They fought with cold calculation, viewing the duel as a problem to be solved rather than a contest to be won, and their emotional detachment saved them from the curse, even as it denied them any lasting recognition for their achievement. By the time the galaxy entered its current dark age, with the Great Rift tearing reality itself asunder and demon armies pouring into real space in unprecedented numbers, Lucius had become something barely recognizable as the ambitious young swordsman from Chemos. His armor was more face than metal, thousands upon thousands of screaming visages competing for space on its surface. His sanity was fractured, held together only by his obsession with finding worthy opponents and the temporary peace that combat brought. His body bore scars in such density that they formed a solid mass of scar tissue, obliterating any trace of what his original features might have been. He no longer remembered how many times he had died. The resurrections blurred together, each one feeling both familiar and novel, when sometimes he would awaken with no memory of who his killer had been or what circumstances had led to his death. The gaps in his recollection, evidence of the psychological toll his immortality was exacting. Other times, he would remember every detail with crystalline clarity, able to replay the fatal duel in his mind over and over, analyzing where his technique had failed, where his opponent had proven superior. The Primarch Fulgrim, now a demon prince barely recognizable as the noble warrior who had once led the Emperor's children, occasionally took interest in his champion. These encounters were unsettling, even for someone as far gone as Lucius. Fulgrim existed partially outside normal reality, his physical form a monstrous fusion of human, demon, and serpent that shifted and changed according to no physical laws. When the demon Primarch spoke to Lucius, it was with voices that harmonized in impossible ways, offering praise and criticism in the same breath, promising rewards and threatening punishments without apparent contradiction. Fulgrim recognized that Lucius's curse was both his greatest strength and his ultimate vulnerability. The immortality made him useful as a champion, someone who could be deployed against any enemy without fear of permanent loss. But the psychological damage was making him increasingly unreliable, more focused on his personal quest for perfect duels than on serving the Legion or advancing Slaanesh's interests in the galaxy. The demon Primarch tolerated this independence because Lucius remained effective, and because watching his gradual descent into complete madness provided entertainment. But the weapons of damnation. The Blade of Leia remained Lucius's constant companion across the millennia, the sword that Fulgrim had gifted him, serving as both weapon and symbol of his damnation. The blade itself was a masterwork of Xenos craftsmanship, forged by the Serpentine Leia, using techniques that humanity had never fully understood. Its single curved edge could part ceramite armor as easily as flesh, the alien alloys maintaining a perfect edge despite the countless battles it had endured. The silver metal seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it, giving the blade an otherworldly appearance that marked it as something beyond mere steel. In Lucius's hands, the Blade of Leia became an extension of his will with a precision that even the finest power weapons could not match. Where other swords required conscious adjustment to account for balance and weight distribution, this blade seemed to know what Lucius wanted before he fully formed the intention. Complex techniques that should have required careful timing and absolute body control became effortless. The sword moved where he wished it to move, struck where he intended it to strike, responded to the subtlest shifts in his grip or stance as if it were part of his body rather than a separate object. The blade's history was written in the blood of champions from across the galaxy. It had tasted the flesh of loyalist space marines, whose names were recorded in the annals of their chapters as heroes. It had cut down Eldar, who had survived for centuries through skill and speed. Yet it had defeated Orc warbosses, whose size and strength should have made them invincible to a weapon of such relatively small dimensions. Each kill added to the blade's legend, building a reputation that preceded Lucius into battle. There were practical advantages to wielding a weapon of such renown. Opponents who recognized the Blade of Leia knew they faced not just a skilled swordsman, but one who carried a weapon that had ended countless lives. This psychological edge often proved as valuable as any technical advantage the blade might provide. Warriors would hesitate, second-guessing their technique, wondering if they were about to join the long list of champions who had fallen to that silver edge. But the blade also had a peculiar quality that Lucius never fully understood. After each resurrection, and after his consciousness emerged in a new body, the Blade of Leia would somehow find its way back to him. Sometimes it would be recovered from the battlefield where he had fallen. Other times, it would appear in ways that defied logical explanation, waiting in his quarters aboard a ship he had never visited, clutched in the hands of a cultist who had no memory of acquiring it, embedded in a wall near wherever Lucius had awakened. Fabius Bile theorized that the sword had been marked by the demon that had once been imprisoned within it, that Slaanesh's influence on the weapon ensured it would always return to the Dark Prince's champion. Lucius's other primary weapon was the Lash of Torment, a gift from Slaanesh that embodied the Dark Prince's nature in physical form. Unlike the Blade of Leia, which was a product of Xenos craftsmanship, but the lash was born from the warp itself, a demon weapon that existed as much in the Imperium as in real space. It took the form of a whip or multiple tendrils, the exact configuration shifting according to Lucius's needs in combat. The material of the lash was warm to the touch, like living flesh, and unsettling in ways that went beyond mere tactile sensation. The lash of torment was equipped with cruelly barbed hooks along its length, each one capable of tearing through armor and flesh with equal ease. But the true horror of the weapon was not in its physical damage, but in what it did to the minds of those it touched. The lash carried with it a fragment of Slanesh's essence, and contact with it induced sensations that overwhelmed the target's consciousness. Pain and pleasure became indistinguishable, and horror and ecstasy merged into a single devastating experience that could break even the strongest will. In battle, Lucius wielded both weapons with ambidextrous mastery. The blade of Leia in his left hand served as his primary killing tool, employed with techniques honed over 10,000 years of constant combat. The lash of torment in his right hand provided crowd control and psychological warfare, its tendrils reaching out to snare enemies at range, pulling them off balance or dragging them into killing distance for the blade. The combination of weapons gave him capabilities that few could counter, able to engage multiple opponents simultaneously or to focus both weapons on a single challenging target. The combat style this required was uniquely suited to Lucius's abilities. He moved with a fluidity that seemed to defy physics. His enhanced space marine physiology pushed to its absolute limits. To observers, he appeared to blur between positions, the blade striking from one angle, while the lash attacked from another, his body flowing through stances that connected offense and defense in seamless combination. Even other space marines, themselves superhuman warriors with reflexes measured in microseconds, found it difficult to track his movements when he achieved full combat flow. Augmenting these weapons and his natural abilities were combat stimulants of remarkable potency. Lucius wore on his back a device of Dark Eldar origin, a stim rack that had been won as a prize in the gladiatorial arenas of Camorra. The Drukhari were masters of chemical enhancement, having spent millennia perfecting drugs that could push mortal bodies beyond their normal limits. This particular device was a prize awarded to champions, a mark of recognition from beings who understood pain and pleasure as fundamental forces of existence. The stimrack worked through a series of injectors that penetrated directly into Lucius's enhanced organs, bypassing normal metabolism to deliver chemicals straight to his bloodstream. Combat drugs flooded his system in carefully measured doses, heightening his already superhuman reflexes, sharpening his senses to levels that bordered on prescient awareness, pushing his strength and speed beyond what even space marine physiology normally allowed. The pain of the injectors activating was itself a form of stimulant, a sharp sensation that brought crystal clarity to his thoughts. But these enhancements came at a cost. The drugs were not meant for long-term use, even by beings as hardy as space marines. Over centuries of constant stimulant use, Lucius's body had developed dependencies and tolerances that required ever-increasing doses to achieve the same effects. Between battles, when the drugs wore off, he experienced withdrawal symptoms that would have killed a normal human and left even other space marines incapacitated. Only his obsessive need for combat drove him to endure the cycling between chemical high and devastating crash. The armor of shrieking souls that Lucius wore was perhaps the most horrific aspect of his appearance. Where once it had been a suit of artificer armor, carefully crafted to provide maximum protection while allowing full freedom of movement, it had been transformed into something that violated the boundary between equipment and living being. The armor was powered, not by conventional plasma reactors or other mechanical systems, but by the thousands of souls trapped within it, the consciousness of every warrior who had ever defeated Lucius and been claimed by the curse. These trapped souls were not merely passive prisoners. They retained some fragment of awareness, enough to understand their fate, but not enough to do anything about it. They screamed constantly, their voices creating a cacophony that only Lucius could hear. Each soul cried out its own particular torment, rage at having been denied their victory, horror at their transformation, despair at their eternal imprisonment. The newest additions to the armor still retained enough individual identity to plead or threaten or curse. Yet the oldest had been worn down by millennia of imprisonment until they were little more than wordless screams. The armor could discharge this accumulated anguish as a weapon. When Lucius willed it, the screaming that filled his mind became externalized, projected outward as a sonic attack that could shatter eardrums and ruffle internal organs. The sound was more than mere noise. It carried with it the emotional weight of all those trapped souls, their suffering and rage given physical form. Warriors who faced this attack found their own minds assaulted by despair and horror, their confidence shattered by an assault that bypassed armor and struck directly at the psyche. Yet the armor also provided Lucius with protection that went beyond simple physical shielding, as the souls trapped within seemed to serve as additional layers of defense against both material and immaterial attacks. Weapons that should have penetrated his armor were deflected by forces that had nothing to do with the metal's thickness or the quality of its construction. Psychic attacks that should have overwhelmed his mind were absorbed and dispersed by the thousands of consciousness swirling through the armor. In a very real sense, Lucius was protected by the accumulated will and life force of everyone he had ever been forced to become. The hollow victory. In the 41st millennium, when the galaxy teetered on the edge of complete annihilation and the forces of chaos poured through the Great Rift in numbers not seen since the Horus Heresy, Lucius continued his endless quest for perfect combat, where the faultless war band had grown into a significant force. Several hundred Emperor's children and associated cultists united by their dedication to martial perfection through excess. They moved from war zone to war zone, seeking not strategic objectives, but worthy opponents, measuring success not in territory controlled, but in the quality of enemies defeated. Lucius's reputation had spread throughout the Imperium. He was listed in the threat assessments of multiple Space Marine chapters, identified as a priority target whose elimination would significantly weaken the Emperor's children's operational capability. The Inquisition maintained files detailing his known appearances, his tactics, his victims. Stories circulated among the Imperial Guard and planetary defense forces about the swordsman who could not die, who wore the faces of his victims, who moved like death incarnate through any battlefield. The loyalist space marines who hunted him learned to be wary. Simply killing Lucius achieved nothing if the warrior who landed the fatal blow took any satisfaction in the victory. This created a bizarre tactical situation where Marines who might normally have celebrated eliminating such a dangerous enemy had to cultivate complete emotional detachment. The few who succeeded in killing Lucius without triggering the curse did so by viewing him not as a champion to be defeated, but as a problem to be solved, eliminating emotion from the equation entirely. On the demon world, where Fulgrim held court, Lucius was always welcome. The Primarch, or the daemon wearing his form, he maintained a palace of impossible architecture where physics itself seemed negotiable and the walls breathed with alien life. Here, the Emperor's children gathered when they were not campaigning, pursuing their various obsessions in an environment where excess was not merely permitted but encouraged. Gladiatorial contests were held regularly, providing entertainment for the Primarch and his court, while allowing warriors to test themselves against each other in combat that might or might not result in actual death. Lucius dominated these contests as thoroughly as he had dominated them 10,000 years ago when Sirius had defeated him. But victory had become hollow. He fought opponents who knew that defeating him came with a terrible price, who either fought without full commitment or who courted their own damnation by seeking to trigger the curse. Neither scenario provided the satisfaction of genuine competition, the thrill of truly uncertain outcome, of facing an opponent who might actually best him without supernatural consequences, had become increasingly rare. The psychological toll of his existence had become severe. Lucius no longer slept in any conventional sense. The moment his mind began to relax, the screaming of the souls in his armor would intensify, denying him rest. His memory had become fragmentary, entire decades sometimes vanishing from his recollection, leaving only the vague impression of battles fought and opponents defeated. His personality had fractured into competing impulses that didn't always align with rational thought or even self-preservation. There were moments, increasingly frequent as the millennia wore on, when Lucius would stop mid-battle and simply stand still, weapon lowered, as if listening to something only he could hear. His opponents, if they were wise, would use these moments to retreat rather than press their advantage. The curse was indiscriminate. Kill Lucius during one of these episodes, and the transformation would claim you just as thoroughly as if you had defeated him in fair combat. Some speculated that these were moments when the accumulated souls were trying to communicate with him, attempting to share some insight or warning. Others believed it was simply his fragmenting mind, losing cohesion, glitching like a damaged cogitator. The one thing that could still bring Lucius something approaching genuine pleasure was the discovery of a truly worthy opponent, and someone whose skill approached or even exceeded his own. These encounters were vanishingly rare. Most warriors simply couldn't match 10,000 years of constant combat experience, but occasionally Lucius would find someone special, a space marine captain who had dedicated his entire existence to the blade, an elder exarch so ancient that even other craft-world warriors considered them a living legend, a chaos champion blessed by one of the other gods with abilities that could challenge Lucius's technique. These duels were the closest Lucius came to experiencing the satisfaction he had known in his early years. For those brief periods when the outcome was genuinely uncertain, when he had to push himself to absolute limits to avoid defeat, the screaming in his mind would quiet, the faces in his armor would fall silent. And the fractured pieces of his consciousness would align into something approaching the focused warrior he had once been. In those moments, Lucius was at peace, experiencing the pure joy of doing what he had been created to do. But even these moments were tainted by the knowledge of what would come after. If he won, he added another scar, another mark, another victory to a tally that had long since lost any meaning. If he lost, the curse would claim another victim, and he would awaken having consumed yet another worthy opponent who might have provided years of rivalry and challenge had fate been different. There was no path to lasting satisfaction, no way to achieve the recognition and glory he had once craved, because any opponent skilled enough to best him would be transformed into another face screaming in his armor. The curse had become his prison, immortality transformed into eternal torment. He could not die, could not rest, could not escape the consequences of his own obsession with perfection. Every victory was hollow, because true defeat was impossible. Every opponent who showed promise became another tragic addition to his armor. The thing he wanted most, recognition as the greatest swordsman in the galaxy, was denied to him because anyone who could legitimately claim superiority by defeating him would cease to exist as a separate individual, their achievement erased by their transformation into part of Lucius himself. Fabius Bile, who had resurrected Lucius on Idris all those millennia ago, maintained a clinical interest in his evolution. During the rare times when their paths crossed, Bile would examine Lucius with the detached curiosity of a scientist, studying a particularly interesting specimen. The chief apothecary had long since abandoned any pretense of serving the emperor's children as a unified legion, pursuing his own experiments in the fusion of flesh and technology, but he maintained connections with notable figures from his past. After one such examination, Bile offered his assessment with characteristic bluntness. The curse that Slaanesh had placed on Lucius was not merely a blessing of immortality, but a form of divine torture. Each resurrection took something from him: fragments of memory, pieces of personality, portions of the man he had been. Eventually, Bile theorized, there would be nothing left of the original Lucius. He would become a hollow vessel, his entire being nothing more than accumulated faces and fractured consciousness, a weapon wielded by Slaanesh with no will or identity of its own. Lucius's response to this diagnosis was to laugh, a sound that held no genuine humor. Whether Bile was right or wrong mattered little. Lucius was long past the point where he could choose a different path. The curse was part of him now, as integral to his existence as the twin hearts that beat in his chest, or the enhanced organs that made him more than human. He would continue to fight because fighting was all he knew, all he had ever truly known, and the only time he found anything approaching peace. The eternal present. In the current age, as the galaxy burns and the forces of the Imperium struggle desperately to hold back the tide of chaos, Lucius the Eternal continues his endless campaign. The great rift that divides the galaxy in two has made travel easier for servants of the dark gods, allowing demonic forces and traitor warbands to strike deep into Imperial space with unprecedented freedom. The Faultless makes use of these opportunities, emerging from the warp to launch raids that serve no strategic purpose beyond identifying and defeating the finest warriors the Imperium can field. The various Space Marine chapters have developed different strategies for dealing with Lucius when he appears. Some, like the Black Templars, view him as an abomination that must be destroyed regardless of the consequences, trusting in their faith to protect them from the curse, or simply accepting that some prices must be paid to eliminate such evil. These warriors engage Lucius in honorable combat, often falling to his superior skill and millennia of experience, their deaths adding more faces to his already crowded armor. Other chapters take a more pragmatic approach. The Raven Guard, remembering Nikona Sharokin's example from 10,000 years ago, train their warriors in emotional discipline, specifically to counter the curse. They teach that victory over Lucius must be achieved with the same detachment one might feel when eliminating any other battlefield obstacle. Satisfaction in a job done, yes, but no pride in the achievement, no sense of personal triumph that might trigger the transformation. Some of their warriors have succeeded in this approach, killing Lucius without triggering the curse, though the technique is difficult to master and failure means damnation. At the Grey Knights, Space Marines specifically created and trained to combat the supernatural threats of chaos, approach Lucius differently still. They recognize him as a creature whose existence is sustained primarily by warp energy, the curse being a direct manifestation of Slaanesh's will. Their attacks focus not on simply killing his body, but on disrupting the connection to the Dark Prince that allows his resurrections. Whether this approach has ever succeeded is uncertain. The Grey Knights do not share the details of their battles with outsiders, and Lucius continues to plague the galaxy, which suggests that if they have found a permanent solution, they have not yet implemented it successfully. Among the forces of chaos, Lucius's reputation is more complex. Other champions recognize his skill and the favor that Slaanesh has shown him, but they also see the price he has paid for that favor. He is simultaneously envied and pitied, admired and avoided. Warriors dedicated to Horn view him with particular disdain, seeing his curse as proof of Slaanesh's weakness. A true champion of the Blood God would simply return to battle through sheer rage and determination, not through the theft of another's body. The servants of Nurgle find a different kind of humor in Lucius's predicament. The Plague God delights in inevitable decay and the ultimate futility of all struggles against entropy. Lucius's endless cycle of death and resurrection, his gradual degradation into something barely recognizable as the warrior he once was, exemplifies the kind of dark joke that Nurgle appreciates. Plague Marines who encounter Lucius in battle sometimes deliberately avoid killing him, seeing more value in letting him continue his slow deterioration than in adding their faces to his armor. Tzeentch's followers view Lucius as an object lesson in the dangers of static perfection. The architect of fate values change, mutation, and evolution above all things. Lucius's obsessive pursuit of perfect swordsmanship, his resistance to truly adapting or evolving beyond the warrior he has always been, represents everything that Tzeentch opposes. Sorcerers, aligned with the Changer of Ways, sometimes arrange circumstances to force Lucius into situations where swordsmanship alone cannot achieve victory, attempting to break his fixation and open him to new forms of power. So far, these efforts have failed. Lucius remains devoted to the blade to the exclusion of all else. Fulgrim himself has become increasingly distant from his champions as he descends deeper into demonic existence. The Primarch spends most of his time on his daemon world, experiencing sensation and excess in forms that mortals cannot comprehend. But he still values Lucius as a tool, if not as an individual. When the Emperor's children need a champion for some particularly important task, when a worthy opponent has been identified who requires the attention of the Legion's finest swordsman, Fulgrim will sometimes reach out to Lucius directly, speaking to him through visions or dreams, or simply manifesting in his presence with casual disregard for the barriers between real space and the warp. These encounters are deeply unsettling, even for someone as thoroughly corrupted as Lucius. Fulgrim's attention feels like being examined by a force of nature that happens to be able to speak. The Demon Primarch's words carry weight beyond their literal meaning, resonating in ways that affect reality itself. When Fulgrim gives Lucius a task, it is not a request or even an order, but rather a reshaping of probable futures to ensure that Lucius finds himself in the necessary position to carry out the Primarch's will. The most recent major campaign involving Lucius took place during the War of Beasts in the Ullanor system, where a massive convergence of Orc forces threatened to overwhelm multiple Imperial sectors. The Greenskins had gathered under the leadership of several particularly powerful war bosses, creating a war machine of unprecedented scale. The Imperium committed significant forces to containing the threat, including multiple Space Marine chapters and entire armies of Imperial Guard. The Emperor's children, characteristically, cared nothing for the strategic implications of an Orc empire rising in that region of space. What interested them was the quality of opponents such a massive gathering would attract. Lucius led the Faultless into the heart of the conflict, seeking out the mightiest warriors on all sides. He fought Imperial champions who had been dispatched to lead the defense, crossed blades with Orc war bosses whose size and ferocity were legendary even among greenskins, and engaged with mercenary forces and opportunistic Xenos who had been drawn to the conflict by the promise of profit or glory. One particular war boss, known as Two Claws, for the massive power claws that replaced both his hands, has proved to be exactly the kind of opponent Lucius had been seeking. Two Claws was enormous even by Orc standards, nearly the size of a dreadnought, with a fighting style that combined brutal strength with surprising tactical awareness. The duel between them lasted for nearly an hour, an eternity in combat between beings of their capability, and ranged across the battlefield as they exchanged blows that could have felled vehicles. Lucius eventually prevailed, his superior technique allowing him to identify and exploit the weaknesses in Two Claws' guard. The Blade of Leia found the gaps in the war boss's armor, delivering wounds that would have killed a smaller opponent outright, but merely enraged the massive greenskin. It took multiple fatal strikes before Two Claws finally fell, and his enormous body crashing to the ground with force that left a crater. And as he died, the war boss let out what might have been a laugh, a sound that suggested he had enjoyed the fight, even as it killed him. For a moment, Lucius thought he might have found true death. Two Claws' satisfaction in the battle had been purely about the experience of fighting a worthy opponent, rather than pride in victory. The Orc had been dying even as he expressed his enjoyment. But then the familiar sensation began, reality shifting around him as Slaanesh's curse activated. Some fragment of Two Claws' consciousness had taken satisfaction in having found such a fight before dying, and that was enough. Lucius awoke in the war boss's transformed body, an experience fundamentally different from his usual resurrections. Orc physiology was alien in ways that even Eldar or Necron bodies were not, operating on principles that had as much to do with psychic resonance and collective belief as with biology. The transformation was more violent, more disorienting than usual. Two Claws' face joined the thousands in his armor, rendered in green skin and tusks, forever screaming in a language that mixed brutish low Gothic with the guttural tongue of the Orcs. The incident reinforced what Lucius had learned over millennia. The curse was not bound by the limitations of biology or species. Slanesh's reach extended across all boundaries, claiming anyone who took satisfaction in defeating the Dark Prince's champion, regardless of what form they wore or what reality they inhabited. It was simultaneously a demonstration of divine power and divine cruelty, a proof that Lucius's imprisonment in eternal life could not be escaped through any conventional means. The price of perfection. The psychological deterioration that Fabius Bile had predicted was becoming increasingly evident to anyone who encountered Lucius. He could no longer maintain coherent conversations for extended periods, his attention wandering mid-sentence as if responding to voices only he could hear. The faces in his armor had multiplied to such density that there was barely any visible metal remaining, just an endless sea of tortured visages that shifted and moved as if trying to press through from the other side. His warband noticed the changes, but could do little about them. The Faultless had been organized around Lucius's obsession with perfect dueling, and that core purpose remained intact even as its leader descended into madness. They continued to seek out worthy opponents, continued to arrange the confrontations that Lucius craved, continued to witness his victories and his deaths and his resurrections. Some of them had served him for centuries, watching his slow transformation from merely obsessed to something that barely qualified as sane. The senior members of the warband had developed strategies for managing Lucius's condition. They learned to recognize the signs that preceded his episodes of catatonia, the blank stares and sudden stillness that indicated his mind had retreated into itself. During these periods, they would form a protective cordon around him, ensuring that no enemy could exploit his vulnerability. The episodes rarely lasted more than a few minutes, but in the chaos of battle, even seconds of inattention could prove fatal. They also learned to anticipate his needs in ways that went beyond mere military logistics. Lucius required constant combat to maintain his fragile equilibrium. Too long between battles and the screaming in his mind would intensify beyond his ability to cope, driving him into rages that could turn on his own forces if no enemy was available. The Faultless became adept at identifying potential conflicts, at manufacturing reasons to engage enemies, even when no strategic purpose was served. But there were limits to how much they could help him. The fundamental problem, that Lucius was a consciousness being slowly consumed by thousands of other consciousness, and that his identity was fragmenting under the assault of accumulated souls, could not be addressed by any conventional means. They could manage the symptoms but not cure the underlying condition. Lucius was trapped in a cycle that would continue until either Slanesh withdrew the blessing, or Lucius degraded to the point where nothing of his original self remained. There were theories among the warband about whether Lucius could actually be permanently killed. Some believed that if he died without anyone taking satisfaction in the kill, if he was destroyed in an industrial accident, or killed by someone who viewed it as a regrettable necessity rather than a victory, the curse would have no target to claim, and Lucius would finally achieve true death. Others argued that Slanesh would simply resurrect him directly, and not bothering with the transformative curse if no suitable vessel was available. A few dark rumors suggested that Lucius had actually achieved true death multiple times, that there had been deaths where the curse found no target, and he had passed beyond the veil. But in these cases, the rumors claimed, Slanesh had personally intervened, plucking Lucius's soul from whatever afterlife awaited the damned and forcing it back into material existence. If these stories were true, they suggested that Lucius's imprisonment went beyond the mechanisms of the curse, that the Dark Prince had claimed him so completely that even death without a curse trigger would not provide escape. Lucius himself never spoke about such possibilities. His focus remained entirely on the present moment, on the next duel, the next opponent, at the next opportunity to achieve that perfect flow state where the screaming stopped, and he became pure warrior instinct. The past was fragmentary and unreliable, his memories having been eroded by centuries of deaths and resurrections. The future was incomprehensible, extending infinitely forward in an endless parade of battles that would never bring lasting satisfaction. Only the immediate present held any reality for him. His relationship with his weapons had evolved into something approaching religious devotion. The blade of Leia and the lash of torment were the only constants in his existence, the tools that allowed him to achieve the moments of clarity he craved. He maintained them with meticulous care, ensuring that the blade's edge remained perfect, that the lash's hooks stayed sharp and cruel. Between battles, when the screaming in his mind was at its worst, he would sometimes simply hold the weapons, finding a small measure of comfort in their familiar weight and balance. The stim rack on his back had been modified and upgraded countless times over the millennia. What had begun as a Dark Elder prize had been enhanced by the warband's own apothecaries and sorcerers, transformed into something unique to Lucius's needs. The chemicals it delivered were no longer purely physical stimulants, but alchemical compounds that blurred the line between material and immaterial, affecting both body and soul. When the stim rack activated during combat, Lucius experienced reality through a lens that made time seem to slow, that allowed him to perceive threats before they fully materialized. That pushed his already superhuman capabilities into realms that approached the demonic. But the price for these enhanced capabilities was steep. The withdrawal between doses had become so severe that Lucius could barely function without the chemicals in his system. His natural state, if such a thing could be said to exist, was one of constant pain and disorientation. Only the stim rack's cocktail of drugs allowed him to achieve the focus necessary for combat. And even then, the clarity was temporary and increasingly fragile. The faces. Remember, among the thousands of souls trapped in Lucius's armor, certain voices were louder than others, certain faces more prominent in the ever-shifting mass that covered his warplate. These were the warriors who had possessed the strongest will in life, whose consciousness had not been completely subsumed by the transformation. They retained enough individuality to sometimes communicate with Lucius, speaking to him in the quiet moments between battles when his mind was most vulnerable. Lord Commander Sirius, the first to be claimed by the curse, remained one of the most vocal. His was a voice of accusation and rage, endlessly recounting the moment of his victory, the satisfaction he had felt, the pride in having defeated the legendary Lucius. That satisfaction had damned him, transformed him into the first of many, and his fury at the injustice of it never dimmed. Sometimes Lucius could hear Sirius screaming specific words, fragments of sentences that conveyed his eternal torment. "I won. I defeated you. It was my moment. My victory." The Eldar souls trapped in the armor spoke in melodious languages that Lucius did not understand, but their emotional content was clear enough. They sang songs of mourning, laments for lives cut short, and souls denied entry to their racial afterlife. The Elder understood better than most what it meant to have one's soul claimed by one of the dark gods, and their horror at their fate resonated through their endless keening. Some had been exarchs, warrior souls so dedicated to combat that they could never truly rest, even in life. Now they were denied even the half-existence of their war masks, trapped instead in eternal torment as part of a being they despised. The orc souls were different, their psychic presence more crude but no less persistent. They roared and bellowed, reliving battles in fractured memories, sometimes laughing at the absurdity of their situation. Orcs had a peculiar relationship with death, their collective psychic field ensuring that they rarely felt true fear of mortality. But being trapped as part of a non-orc denied the possibility of reincarnation through their race's spore-based reproduction was a violation of their fundamental nature that drove them to constant rage. More disturbing were the human souls, the fellow space marines who had defeated Lucius in honest combat, only to be claimed by the curse. These were warriors who had once served the Emperor, who had dedicated their lives to defending humanity from the very forces that had corrupted Lucius. Now they were part of him, forced to witness and participate in every atrocity he committed, every battle he fought against their former brothers. Yet their voices carried the weight of ultimate betrayal, cursing Lucius for existing cursing themselves for falling into Slanesh's trap, cursing the Dark Prince for creating such an abomination. Some of these voices occasionally broke through Lucius's fragmenting consciousness with enough force to affect his actions. There were documented instances where Lucius had hesitated mid-strike, his blade stopping centimeters from an opponent's throat, as if held back by invisible hands. His face would contort in apparent internal struggle, multiple expressions warring for dominance. Then the moment would pass, control would reassert itself, and the strike would fall with redoubled force, as if compensating for the hesitation. The warband sorcerers studied these incidents with great interest, as they theorized that the souls in Lucius's armor were not completely powerless, that in moments when his will faltered, they could exert limited influence over his physical form. This created a bizarre situation where Lucius was simultaneously one being and thousands, a singular consciousness wrapped in and infiltrated by the accumulated awareness of everyone he had ever been forced to become. There was evidence to suggest that some of the trapped souls were trying to help him, attempting to guide his actions toward choices that might eventually break the curse or achieve some form of redemption. These were likely the warriors who had retained the strongest moral framework despite their damnation, who still believed on some level that Lucius, or what he had been before the curse, was worth saving. Their efforts were subtle, as limited by their lack of direct control, manifesting as intuitions or sudden insights that Lucius would experience without understanding their source. Other souls were actively malicious, seeking to destroy Lucius from within by eroding what remained of his sanity. These were the ones who had embraced their damnation, who had concluded that if they must suffer eternally, then they would ensure Lucius suffered as well. They whispered poisonous suggestions during his vulnerable moments, encouraged his worst impulses, fed the obsessions that were slowly consuming him. Between the souls trying to help and those trying to harm, Lucius's mind had become a battlefield where he was simultaneously all combatants and the territory being fought over. Fabius Bile, during one of his examinations, had attempted to communicate directly with some of the trapped souls. Using forbidden techniques that combined psychic probing with physical manipulation of the armor, he managed to isolate and amplify individual voices. What he learned was both fascinating and horrifying. The souls were aware of everything Lucius experienced, but had no direct access to his senses or thoughts. They existed in a state of constant disorientation, receiving sensory input, but unable to process it properly, aware that time was passing, but unable to track its progression, knowing they had once been individuals, but finding those memories increasingly difficult to access. Bile theorized that eventually, all the souls would degrade to the point where they were nothing but pure suffering, awareness without identity or memory. At that point, the armor would become simply a reservoir of raw anguish, a psychic weapon that projected accumulated torment at anyone who came near. Lucius would still hear the screaming, but it would no longer be the voices of individuals. It would be a single, unified howl of eternal damnation. The chief apothecary also discovered something unexpected during these examinations. Some of the souls appeared to be fading, their psychic signatures growing weaker over time. He couldn't determine whether this represented a form of true death, a gradual dissolution into nothingness, or if it was simply that their consciousness was being absorbed more fully into the armor itself. If it was the latter, it suggested that Lucius was not merely carrying these souls, but slowly consuming them, integrating their essence into his own in ways that went beyond the physical transformation that created each face. This possibility raised disturbing questions about what Lucius was becoming. If he was absorbing the consciousness of every warrior who defeated him, integrating their skills and experiences into his own, then he was evolving into something unprecedented, a composite being that represented the accumulated martial knowledge of thousands of the galaxy's finest warriors. His skill with the blade was no longer purely his own, but rather the distilled expertise of everyone who had ever bested him, their techniques and insights becoming part of his arsenal, even as their identities were erased. The rematch that never comes. Among all the souls trapped in Lucius's armor, among all the warriors he had been forced to become, there remained one notable absence. Nakona Sharokin, the Raven Guard, who had killed Lucius on Idris during the Horus heresy, had taken no satisfaction in the kill. His emotional discipline had saved him from the curse, and he had gone on to further service before disappearing into the chaos of the Siege of Terror. Whether he had survived to the present day, whether he had died in the Emperor's service, whether he had achieved some other fate, Lucius did not know and could not discover. This ignorance gnawed at him more than any of his confirmed defeats. At least with warriors like Sirius or Two Claws, there was a resolution. They had defeated him, the curse had claimed them, and their story had ended. But Sharokin remained an unresolved thread, a warrior who had proven superior to Lucius and escaped the consequences. But in the rare moments when Lucius's mind achieved something like clarity, when the screaming quieted and he could think coherently, he would find himself obsessing over that ancient defeat. The Raven Guard had beaten him twice, actually. Their first encounter aboard the Sisypheum had resulted in Sharokin giving Lucius a scar across his cheek, demonstrating clear superiority even in that brief exchange. Their second meeting on Idris had ended with Lucius's death, Sharokin's twin gladii piercing both hearts with surgical precision, and through both encounters, the Raven Guard had felt nothing but contempt, viewing Lucius as a target to be eliminated rather than a warrior to be defeated. That contempt was perhaps the worst part. Lucius had built his entire identity around being worthy of respect, of recognition, and of acknowledgement from other warriors. To be dismissed as merely a rabid dog who needs to be put down struck at the core of everything he believed about himself. Sharokin had denied him even the respect that an enemy might show to a dangerous opponent, treating his elimination as an unfortunate chore rather than a significant achievement. Over the millennia, Lucius had made multiple attempts to find Sharokin or discover his fate. He had interrogated captured Raven Guard, though none knew what had become of a warrior from 10,000 years ago. He had consulted sorcerers and seers, asking them to scry for any sign of Sharokin's continued existence. He had even approached demonic entities, offering bargains in exchange for information about the Raven Guard's ultimate fate. None of these efforts had yielded useful results. Yet the Raven Guard maintained careful records of their fallen, but Sharokin's name appeared in no list of the dead, no roll of the honored. Nor did he appear in any account of serving Space Marines or known survivors from the heresy era. He had simply vanished, either dying in some unrecorded way during the Siege of Terror, or disappearing into the same shadows that had defined his fighting style. The possibility that Sharokin might still exist somewhere, that after 10,000 years he might have survived through some unknown means, drove Lucius to occasional bouts of frenzied searching. He would deploy the Faultless to hunt for any trace of the ancient warrior, interrogating every Raven Guard they encountered, searching through archives and records wherever they could be found. These searches always ended in disappointment, leaving Lucius more frustrated and unbalanced than before. But even if Sharokin was long dead, even if he had died in the service of the Emperor during the Siege of Terror or in the dark years that followed, his absence from Lucius's armor represented something profound. Here was proof that the curse could be defeated, that warriors existed who possessed the discipline to kill Lucius without triggering the transformation. If Sharokin had done it, others could learn to do it as well. This knowledge had spread throughout the Imperium's military forces. Training manuals for Space Marines now included sections on engaging Lucius the Eternal, with specific emphasis on maintaining emotional discipline during combat. The technique was difficult to master. Natural human psychology associated victory with satisfaction, as made it nearly impossible to achieve something significant without feeling pride in the accomplishment. But some warriors managed it, approaching Lucius with the mindset of pest exterminators rather than duelists, viewing his elimination as a necessary sanitation task rather than a glorious achievement. The Grey Knights had apparently developed the most effective training for this approach. Their entire existence was built around combating chaos, without being corrupted by it, and emotional discipline was a fundamental part of their conditioning. When a Grey Knight faced Lucius, he did so without ego, without pride, without any sense of personal achievement in the outcome. If the Grey Knight won, it was because the Emperor's will had been served, not because the individual warrior had proven superior. That distinction was sufficient to protect them from the curse. Or so the reports claimed. Lucius had faced Grey Knights on multiple occasions, and while he had usually prevailed, there had been times when their psychically charged blades had cut him down. Yet each time, he had awakened in a new body, the curse having found some target to claim. Whether those targets had been the Grey Knights themselves or others who had contributed to his death in less direct ways, Lucius could not say. The curse operated according to its own logic, and Slaanesh did not feel obligated to explain the precise mechanisms to his champion. The obsession with Sharakin and the possibility of warriors who could defeat the curse had become another layer in Lucius's deteriorating mental state. When he would sometimes rant about it during the quiet periods between battles, speaking to warband members who had heard the same stories countless times before. He would describe the duels on the Sisypheum and Idris in obsessive detail, analyzing every technique Sharakin had employed, trying to identify what he could have done differently, how he might have won if given another chance. But there would be no other chance. Either Sharakin was dead, his consciousness long since dispersed or claimed by whatever afterlife awaited those who served the Emperor faithfully, or he existed somewhere beyond Lucius's reach, protected by fate or the Emperor's own intervention from having to face the corrupted swordsman again. The rematch that Lucius craved, or the opportunity to prove that his defeats had been flukes or circumstances rather than demonstrations of genuine inferiority, would never come. This denial of closure was perhaps Slaanesh's cruelest joke. The Dark Prince had granted Lucius immortality, had made him into the Eternal, but had done so in a way that prevented him from ever truly achieving the recognition he craved. Every opponent who beat him became part of him, making it impossible to earn legitimate victory through skill alone. And the one opponent who had escaped this transformation, who could have provided years or even centuries of rivalry and eventual resolution, remained forever out of reach. The modern campaigns. In recent years, as the galaxy has descended further into chaos and the Imperium struggles against threats on all fronts, Lucius has found himself with an abundance of potential opponents. The Great Rift has made travel easier for forces aligned with chaos, allowing the faultless to strike deep into Imperial space with relative impunity. They emerge from warp storms and translate into systems where desperate last stands are being made against overwhelming odds, where Space Marine chapters deploy their greatest champions in forlorn hopes of turning the tide. One such campaign took place in the Damocles Gulf, where the Tau Empire's expansion had drawn the attention of multiple Imperial forces. The Tau themselves held little interest for Lucius. Their philosophy of the greater good meant that individual warriors rarely felt personal pride in victory, viewing success as a collective achievement rather than individual triumph. This made them poor targets for someone seeking opponents who might trigger the curse. But the Space Marines deployed to combat the Tau expansion included champions whose dedication to personal excellence matched anything Lucius had encountered in recent centuries. The White Scars had sent an entire brotherhood, led by a Khan whose blade work was legendary even among a chapter known for its emphasis on speed and precision. When Lucius challenged this Khan to single combat, he found an opponent who fought with a style completely different from his own. Where Lucius sought perfection through control and technique, the White Scars champion achieved excellence through spontaneity and adaptation. The duel lasted for nearly 20 minutes, an eternity when both combatants were capable of delivering killing blows in microseconds. Yet the Khan fought with a curved blade wielded in the traditional style of Chagoris, his attacks flowing like water, each strike leading naturally into the next. Lucius responded with the precision and complexity that characterized his own technique, the blade of Leia weaving patterns that should have been impossible to defend against. In the end, Lucius prevailed, but only barely. The Khan had pushed him to limits he rarely encountered. forcing him to call upon techniques and combinations he had not employed in centuries. The killing blow came when Lucius fainted high and struck low, the blade of Leia's edge finding the weak point in the Khan's armor, where his leg met his torso. As the White Scar's champion fell, he spoke words that Lucius would remember long after the battle ended. "You fight well, but you fight without joy. What is skill without the pleasure of its use?" The question haunted Lucius because he knew the answer. He fought not for joy, but for the brief moments of silence it brought, the temporary cessation of the screaming that filled every other moment of his existence. Combat had become medicine rather than art, a necessary treatment for his fragmenting psyche rather than something to be enjoyed for its own sake. The Khan had seen this truth in the few minutes of their duel, had recognized that for all his technical perfection, Lucius was fundamentally broken. Another significant encounter took place in the Vidar sector, where the Black Templars had deployed a crusade to purge a string of worlds that had fallen to chaos worship. The Black Templars brought with them their Emperor's champion, was a warrior chosen by visions from the Emperor himself to bear the Black Sword into battle against the greatest enemies of mankind. This champion was a legend in his own right, having slain demon princes and traitor primarchs in single combat. When Lucius faced the Emperor's champion on the scarred landscape of Vidar Prime, he found himself confronting not just a skilled warrior, but one imbued with what appeared to be genuine divine power. The Black Sword burned with inner fire, its edge capable of disrupting the connections between Lucius and the souls trapped in his armor. Each strike from that sacred blade sent waves of agony through Lucius's consciousness, and for the first time in centuries, he heard the trapped souls not screaming in torment, but crying out in something approaching hope. The duel was brief and brutal, while the Emperor's champion fought with absolute conviction, each strike delivered with the certainty that he was the instrument of the Emperor's will. Lucius found his usual techniques insufficient against such faith-driven combat. The champion seemed to anticipate his attacks, moving to counter them before Lucius had fully committed to the strike. For a moment, Lucius thought he might finally have found an opponent who could grant him true death, that the Emperor's direct intervention might break the curse. Then the lash of torment found its mark, wrapping around the champion's sword arm and yanking him off balance. The moment of opportunity was all Lucius needed. The blade of Leia plunged into the champion's chest, piercing both hearts with the same precision that Sharokin had once employed against Lucius himself. The Black Templar fell, and as he died, Lucius saw in his eyes not satisfaction in having fought well, but only disappointment that he had failed to complete the Emperor's task. That disappointment saved the Emperor's champion from the curse. He died in service to his god, his final thought not of personal achievement, but of duty unfulfilled. Lucius stood over his body, feeling an emotion he could not quite identify, something between frustration and relief. Another worthy opponent dead, another potential resurrection denied. The pattern continued, unchanging and unchangeable. The campaign that brought Lucius the most recent notoriety occurred in the Nachmund Gauntlet, one of the stable passages through the Great Rift. Here, Imperial and Chaos forces clashed constantly, each seeking to control this vital corridor between the divided halves of the galaxy. The fighting was brutal and unending, perfect conditions for someone like Lucius to find opponents worth his attention. Among the Imperial forces defending the Gauntlet was a contingent from the Blood Angels, including one of their sanguinary guard. These elite warriors represented the pinnacle of the Blood Angels' martial arts, chosen from among the chapter's finest and equipped with ancient relics that dated back to the time of Sanguinius himself. The particular sanguinary guard that Lucius encountered wielded a glaive that had supposedly been blessed by the great angel, its blade said to carry a fraction of the Primarch's own nobility and skill. The duel took place among the ruins of what had once been an imperial cathedral, now shattered by bombardment and corrupted by chaotic energies. Lucius and the sanguinary guard circled each other, each recognizing in the other a warrior of exceptional capability. When they finally engaged, the clash of their weapons sent shockwaves through the air, the force of their strikes shattering already weakened stonework. The sanguinary guard fought with a style that combined technical precision with aggressive forward pressure, constantly pushing toward Lucius, never allowing him the space to set up his more elaborate combinations. The glaive's reach gave him an advantage that Lucius struggled to overcome, forcing him to employ the lash of torment more defensively than he preferred, using it to deflect strikes that he couldn't dodge rather than as an offensive weapon. For several minutes, the outcome remained uncertain, and both warriors were operating at the absolute peak of their capabilities, each exchange of blows testing the limits of what Space Marine reflexes and skill could achieve. Then Lucius saw his opening. The sanguinary guard had committed to a thrust that would have been devastating if it had connected, but the commitment left him momentarily unable to defend his lower body. The blade of Leia swept in low, cutting through armor and flesh, severing the major arteries in the Blood Angel's leg. As the sanguinary guard fell, he attempted one final strike, the glaive sweeping toward Lucius's neck even as life poured from the fatal wound. Lucius caught the blade with the lash of torment, halting it centimeters from his throat. He looked into the dying warrior's eyes and saw something he had not expected: pity. The sanguinary guard pitied him, not for losing the duel, but for winning it, for being trapped in an existence where victory was hollow and defeat was impossible. "You fight alone," the Blood Angel whispered with his final breath. "Even surrounded by thousands, you are alone. That is your true curse." The words struck deeper than any blade had ever penetrated. Lucius stood over the body long after the sanguinary guard had died, contemplating the truth of that statement. The souls in his armor screamed at him, thousands of voices all trying to be heard, but none of them were truly with him. They were prisoners, victims, reminders of failure. He commanded a warband, but they followed him out of shared obsession rather than genuine loyalty or brotherhood. He served a Primarch and a god, but both viewed him as a tool rather than a valued champion. What he was alone in ways that went beyond simple physical isolation. His immortality ensured that everyone he might form a connection with would eventually die while he continued on. His curse meant that any warrior who proved superior to him would be absorbed rather than remembered as a separate individual. Even his own identity was being slowly eroded by the accumulated consciousness of those he had been forced to become. In a very real sense, Lucius was disappearing, fading into a composite being that would eventually contain nothing of the original Chemosan swordsman. The question of ending. Among the warband's sorcerers and those few who dared to study the nature of Lucius's curse, there were ongoing debates about whether he could ever truly be free. Some argued that the curse was absolute, as that Slaanesh had claimed Lucius so thoroughly that escape was impossible. They pointed to the fact that even deaths where no one took satisfaction had somehow resulted in resurrection, suggesting that the Dark Prince would intervene directly rather than allow his champion to achieve final rest. Others believed that there were conditions under which the curse might be broken. If Lucius could somehow be killed in a way that provided absolutely no satisfaction to anyone involved, if the death was so meaningless and random that not even the gods could find purpose in it, perhaps the cycle would end. This was purely theoretical, of course. Arranging such a death while Lucius remained an active combatant seemed impossible. A third faction suggested that the curse might be tied to Lucius's own consciousness and self-perception. As long as he viewed himself as Lucius the Eternal, as long as his identity remained anchored to that conception of self, the curse would continue to operate. But if his mind completely fragmented, if the accumulated souls finally overwhelmed what remained of his original personality, perhaps the being that emerged would no longer be Lucius in any meaningful sense. At that point, the curse might lose its target, unable to resurrect someone who no longer existed as a distinct individual. This last theory was particularly disturbing because it suggested that Lucius's ultimate fate was not death, but dissolution, a gradual fading into a collective consciousness that bore no resemblance to the warrior he had been. He would continue to exist in some sense, but everything that made him Lucius would be gone, replaced by an amalgamation of all the warriors who had ever defeated him. The being that wore his armor would move and fight and kill, but it would be a composite creature, acting on the combined instincts and memories of thousands, rather than the will of a single individual. There were moments when Lucius seemed to recognize this possibility himself. During the periods between battles when the screaming was at its worst, he would sometimes speak about feeling his mind fragmenting, about losing track of which memories were his own and which belonged to the souls trapped in his armor. He would describe sensations and experiences that he had no business knowing, fighting styles he had never studied, languages he had never learned, emotions that belonged to species other than human. Whilst the most disturbing were the moments when he seemed to speak with voices that were not his own, when his tone and manner would shift mid-sentence to match someone else's patterns of speech. The trapped souls were bleeding through, asserting themselves in small ways during his moments of weakness. Each occurrence was brief, quickly suppressed as Lucius reasserted control, but they were becoming more frequent and more difficult to suppress. Fabius Bile, ever the scientist even in damnation, had attempted to measure this degradation through various tests and examinations. He estimated that at the current rate of decay, Lucius's original consciousness would be completely subsumed within another few centuries. After that point, well, the being wearing his armor would be something unprecedented, a gestalt entity composed of fragments from thousands of warriors, operating on collective instinct rather than individual will. What such a creature might be capable of was impossible to predict. It would possess the accumulated combat experience of every warrior Lucius had ever been forced to become, potentially making it the most skilled fighter in the entire galaxy. But it would lack the focused drive and obsessive dedication that had characterized Lucius at his peak. It might be powerful, but directionless, deadly, but without purpose, beyond the immediate satisfaction of Slaanesh's hunger for excess. Slaanesh himself remained enigmatic regarding his intentions for Lucius. The Dark Prince granted visions and sent demon emissaries occasionally, but these communications rarely provided clear direction. Slaanesh seemed content to let Lucius continue on his current trajectory, finding entertainment in watching his champion's slow, psychological dissolution. Whether the god had plans for what Lucius would become once his original personality was completely gone, or whether he simply enjoyed the spectacle of gradual damnation, remained unclear. The eternal struggle. And so Lucius continues, a warrior trapped in an immortality he did not choose and cannot escape. He stalks the battlefields of the 41st Millennium, seeking opponents who might provide moments of clarity, jewels that might quiet the screaming for precious minutes. His armor grows ever more crowded with faces, his mind ever more fragmented, his identity ever more tenuous. Yet still he fights. Us because fighting is all he knows, all he has ever known, and the only time he approaches anything like peace. The Imperium maintains its vigil against him, training its champions to either avoid him entirely or to approach combat with him as an exercise in emotional discipline rather than personal achievement. Space Marine chapters circulate warnings about the swordsman who cannot die, the champion whose defeat dooms the victor to become part of his armor. His name appears in threat assessments and tactical briefings, always accompanied by notes about the futility of conventional victory. The forces of chaos regard him with a mixture of respect and pity. Other champions of Slaanesh see in him both the heights of what devotion to the Dark Prince can achieve and the depths of suffering such devotion can demand. And warriors dedicated to the other gods view him as an object lesson in the price of accepting gifts from the ruinous powers. Even his own warband serves him with the understanding that their leader is as much victim as champion, trapped in a cycle that brings him no lasting satisfaction. Fulgrim watches from his daemon world, occasionally intervening to direct Lucius toward particular challenges, or to provide cryptic advice that may or may not actually help. The demon Primarch seems to view his champion's situation as a form of art, a living sculpture that evolves and changes over time, beautiful in its tragedy and tragic in its beauty. Whether Fulgrim cares at all about what happens to Lucius as an individual, or only values him as an expression of Slaanesh's nature, remains unknown. The souls trapped in Lucius's armor continue to scream, yet their voices a constant chorus of torment that only he can hear. Some have been part of him for millennia, their original identities long since eroded to the point where they are nothing but wordless cries of anguish. Others are more recent additions, still possessing enough coherent thought to plead or threaten or curse the warrior who wears them. All of them are united in suffering, all of them paying the price for having taken satisfaction in defeating the Eternal. When Lucius falls in battle, and he still falls, despite his tremendous skill and millennia of experience, the pattern repeats as it has repeated thousands of times before. He dies, truly and completely dies, his enhanced biology succumbing to injuries that would kill any other warrior. His killer feels some emotion regarding the victory, satisfaction, pride, pleasure, even simple relief that a dangerous enemy has been eliminated, and Slaanesh's curse activates, transforming the killer into a new vessel for Lucius's consciousness, adding another face to the armor, continuing the cycle for another iteration. There may come a time when someone finds a way to permanently kill Lucius the Eternal, when the curse is broken or circumvented, or when Slaanesh himself grows bored with this particular form of torment. There may come a time when Lucius's mind fragments completely, when the Gestalt consciousness that emerges is so different from the original that it can no longer be called by his name. There may even come a time when the galaxy itself ends, when the long war finally concludes one way or another, and the need for eternal champions passes with it. But until any of those potential futures arrive, Lucius will continue. He will seek out worthy opponents and defeat them or be defeated by them. He will add scars to his collection, victories to his tally, faces to his armor. He will experience the brief moments of clarity that combat brings and endure the endless screaming that fills every other moment. He will serve Slaanesh not because he particularly wishes to, but because he has no alternative, no escape from the blessing that has become his prison. He is Lucius the Eternal, the Soul Thief, the faultless blade, the champion of Slaanesh, who cannot die. His story is not one of triumph, but of tragedy, not of glory, but of gradual dissolution. He embodies both the heights of martial excellence and the depths of damnation that await those who pursue perfection without understanding its price. On he is a warning written in scar tissue and screaming faces, a monument to the cruel mercy of the dark gods, a warrior who will fight forever because forever is all he has. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, Lucius stands as perhaps the most tragic figure of all. Not because he suffers, countless beings suffer in the 41st millennium, not because he is damned, the galaxy is full of the damned and the lost, but because he achieved exactly what he sought and found that achieving it destroyed everything that made the achievement meaningful. He became the eternal champion, the undying swordsman, the warrior who could face any opponent without fear of permanent defeat. And in becoming that, he lost himself piece by piece, victim by victim, soul by soul, until what remains is barely recognizable as the ambitious youth from Chemos, who once dreamed of perfection. The blade continues to fall, the faces continue to scream, and Lucius the Eternal continues his endless dance with death, a dance that never truly ends because Slaanesh will not allow it to end, a performance for an audience of one mad god who finds entertainment in suffering elevated to art. This is the price of immortality in a galaxy where the gods are real and their gifts are always poisoned. This is the fate of the champion who cannot die. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of Lucius the Eternal, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more Warhammer 40k content. exploring the darkest corners of the grimdark future. There's so much more to discover in this vast universe of endless war, and I'll be here to guide you through it all.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.